Right, you're welcome back. This is Newsfile. It's your most authoritative news analysis platform, and here on Newsfile, we put Ghana first. So we come to talk about the finances of the economy. We're checking the health of the economy by way of the financial sector. So Bright Simmons is still here with us. He's honorary president of Imani Africa. I don't envy him at this moment, but thank you for the great thoughts that he's been sharing so far. Also joining us is John Abdullahi Jinapo. John Abdullahi Jinapo is MP Yape Kusogo. Thank you for joining us, John. Right. Also here is Gabi Asari Otchere-darko. He is a senior partner at Africa Legal Associates. That's to say he's a legal practitioner. Thanks for joining us, Gabi. Thanks. Right. So a while ago, I was just telling him how I got to know that he's very comfortable with matters of the economy and finance, because some time ago, he actually hosted and moderated a show on finance. I didn't know until then. So thanks for making time to join us. Also here is Doris Ahiate. Doris Ahiate is a chartered banker and CEO of Crescendo. Thank you very much for joining us, Doris. Great. So I want to begin by getting the views of people in the audience and also some of the experts who are seated right by us. Of course, Joe Jackson is seated there, Dalex Finance. He talks the finance matters as blunt as you may want to have it. So maybe if we can have Joe Jackson take the microphone first, so you get to have an idea how some of the people in the audience are thinking. And I'd like us to share with us what you think should be the solution for the taxpayer not to lose, because we have spent over 13 billion Ghana cedis in the cleanup exercise for the banking sector. The last time we were told about any recoveries was a pittance, not up to the 7,000 or so. Prosecutions that were said to happen because of what is said to be a clear rape of the state. Only 3 people have been put on prosecution, and these 3 come from the first 2 banks that suffered, Capital Bank and UT Bank. What can we do to fast-track the process of recovering what the taxpayer is losing and punishing? Oh, please sit. Yeah.
All right. Good morning to everyone. It's good to be here. I think there's one key word you mentioned, fast track. and that obviously sums up what has to be done. At the rate we are going, those who have rigged this country, those who have, and listen, the 13 million you talk about is not the final bill. It's not the final reckoning. The final reckoning could be, some estimates have been as high as 20+ billion. In a country where our budget for the year is 4 billion. That's bordering on ridiculous. It has to be a process where we can't, in the earlier discussion, we talked about corruption and we talked about the judicial process that doesn't seem to work and frustrates all of us. I'm frustrated. I'm simply frustrated because this process is too slow. This process will not recover, and this process will leave those who have raped us with the loot that they have taken. As simple as that. And you will actually be making the situation worse because there's no incentive to practice good behavior. Because I work in the sector, and sometimes I feel as if we are being punished twice. You are punished in the early days for doing the right thing, and you are punished now for doing the right thing. Because it's okay to talk about the commercial banking sector where things seem to be on an evil keel. But come down below that, come to the savings and loans, the finance houses, the microfinance, those who lend to the real sectors of the economy, and there's complete disarray, and life is tough.
Complete disarray, even after 300 plus of them also had their licenses revoked.
Yes, because
and we want to focus on the solutions going forward.
Yes, the solution.
We have been blaming and complaining all year round.
Yes, the solution is simple. One, recover the money. Recover the money.
How?
Fast track a process. I mean, when I have the governor throw his hands up in the air to say the receivers are not collecting, and someone should talk to the
at the last check, I think it was about some 700. 700? That was recovered?
That was recovered. It's ridiculous. We should have a fast track process. That will take these, that will fast track and get these issues through the court process quickly enough for us to say the rule of law was obeyed, and yet we've recovered the money.
Right.
Number two, those who have survived and have been shown to be resilient, especially the local organizations, should be supported. We have a liquidity crunch at the bottom of the pyramid. Those institutions should receive support.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And if you're in the audience and you have any questions about the financial sector or the economy, please walk to the microphone. Okay, you are ready. Introduce yourself and let's have your question. Questioning more particularly, but it's a contribution and concern about what is happening in the financial sector. Let's hear you. From 36 banks, we now have 23 or so, and we are told that they are resilient. Yes, introduce yourself and ask a question.
Ghana here is extremely difficult to get finances from the normal system for agricultural production. Okay. I produce noni juice. US, I applied for finance in US for 1 month. Do you know what? The percentage is 1%. Last minute, they said I'm not a US citizen. They didn't give me the money. Come to Ghana, they are giving it to you 37%. How possible? Can you take money like that, go to the farm, produce noni, produce it and send it? How? And we have people who are managing the financial system and getting that percentage. Where do they get money from? What are you going to use the money for? So the point is, reduce. China is giving 1%. US is giving 1%. Why can't Ghana make it 1%?
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Yes, you.
Yeah. My name is Salim. The financial crisis gave birth to the Consolidated Bank Ghana, which is now the second largest bank in Ghana. Is it not necessary to also consolidate some of the savings and loans whose licenses have been withdrawn so we could have something bigger like the Consolidated Bank?
Thank you. You said the name is?
Salim.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll come back. Just two to start with. I'll come back. So you sit right there. So, start with John. Is there any hope or prospects that the taxpayer will recover this expenditure by the state?
Well, that's a tough one. Thank you very much. First of all, I think that we must be conscious of the fact that some of the aspects of this whole banking sector issue is in court. And so we should be careful with our choice of words. Because I hold a view that you are innocent until proven guilty. And to the extent that some of these matters are before the courts, I think that we should exercise some amount of restraint in passing judgment. Yes, we have an issue on hand. 7 or so banks have gone under. Hundreds of microfinance companies have gone under. And now the ordinary taxpayer is being called upon to shoulder that burden. Because what government is doing is virtually issuing bonds. And I do recall that in Parliament, the last figure that came about was 15.6 billion. And when we did a simulation with them, if everybody was to be paid, we should be looking at something around 20 billion. And if you ask me, body in that sector, it will tell you that banking thrives on confidence. Banking is a matter of confidence. First of all, I hold the view that this whole exercise could have been done in a much more effective manner, in the sense that I hold the view that we should have done a one-off approach rather than taking them in piecemeal. So you take the banks, you send a signal, you go after microfinance, send a signal, go after savings and loans, and then in that order. And when you look at the whole pipeline, this bank owes that bank, that customer owes that customer. And so you would not be looking at the gross amount. You are looking at an amount that can clear the pipeline. And that, for me, is what we should have been looking at. But like you said, the most important thing is the way forward. How can we assure depositors? How can we assure those dealing with the banks that going forward, you still ought to keep your money with the banks? So if you read the budget, clearly, private sector credit has declined from about 17 to 12% or so. And if you look at deposits, it's not encouraging. And so clearly, there's a major issue there for us to deal with. It's been about 2 years now, and all we've recovered is just about 1 billion from the latest report from the receivers. We've recovered just about 1 billion. And so I hold the view that when you are taking a decision to collapse a bank, I hold the view that you should exercise maximum restraint and explore all options available. We just increased the minimum capital requirement to 400. Almost all the local banks couldn't meet that. If we were to apply the law strictly, we would have collapsed those banks. But because of strategic reasons, we've had to take certain decisions to determine how to even shore up their capital and to sustain them. And so clearly, and when I listened to the finance minister, at one of his interviews, I could sense that I thought that government should have looked at this whole issue carefully, the implications and all that, before taking such a major decision to collapse all these.
So the question
institutions.
was on the recoveries, because that's important to the taxpayer. We know that at least 3,000 jobs were saved. We know that 2 million depositors were saved as well. So that's going forward. The money that was also used for that project, how do we get it back? That's really the question, so that we don't go back lamenting.
The only way to get that is to get the receiver to do his work. The receiver is mandated to go after all these defaulters and all those where you can get the money and retrieve them. And don't also forget, the receiver has also been sued. And so this is a matter that even as you want to retrieve monies, you ought to go through due process. You cannot use processes other than using due process to recover that amount. And that's why it may sound like you are lamenting. I think that when taking these decisions, we ought to be a bit careful. But I think that the receiver is trying his best. That's the only thing you can do. Beyond the receiver going after them, it will be very difficult for the ordinary citizen to do that, because the Bank of Ghana is giving that mandate to the receiver. And so we can only push the receiver. I also hold the view that we should try and find a determination as to how we can end this matter. It cannot be in perpetuity. If it means that at a point in time, we should cut it off and write off something, let us do that. I don't think that we can continue in abeyance in dealing with this matter. It's dragged on for a while, and government itself must come to a determination as to how much is even going to spend to deal with this matter. But the figures keep changing. You hear 12,
the suggestion that somebody made is a question that sounds like a suggestion, though, that when it comes to the microfinance entities or finance houses, also we know how that happened. Is there a possibility of looking at merging, even though over 300 of them, in excess of about 400, have lost their licenses?
It will be very difficult to just merge companies. The only way probably will be to raise the capital requirement. So if you say the capital requirement is raised from 2 million to say 10 million, then if you cannot meet that capital requirement, you must then consolidate. And you recall that there was even the discussion to consolidate NIB and ADB. Eventually we decided we wouldn't. And so I think that it's not a matter of just consolidating, It's a matter of strengthening those institutions in
and
terms
what
of
he's
their
asking
regulation
maybe
and
too
all
late
that.
in the day anyway, isn't it?
Certainly, unless you
Right.
decide that going for you want to
Okay.
raise a minimum capital requirement for them.
Okay. So, Gabi, given that you had as many as 23 banks meeting the minimum capital requirements, from 120, is it, to 400? Doesn't that suggest that those had the muscle and they were indeed in good standing, and they should be those that we should have faith in, that they can, keep our financial sector, in good standing? Going forward, is there a way to ensure that we don't come back to this story of having to revoke licenses of banks?
I think so. First of all, in terms of the moves being put in place by the central bank themselves, and we've seen it happen before. It happened in Nigeria. It's happening in Kenya, and even in the West, it's happened. But I think first of all, it is sad that it had to happen to Ghanaian-owned banks, because essentially, if we're looking to develop, and we need to be able to have the finances, to be able to raise the finances locally to develop. A lot of the movements in the city downwards over the last few months has been caused by what? People moving away their cash, because of course big contractors were paid. And a lot of these big contractors are Chinese and the rest of it. They need to go back, take the money back before the end of the year. So it's important that we are able to raise the necessary capital locally, the funds locally, to do so. And to do so, you need banks that are also Ghanaian, so they can also keep their money here. But it's not necessarily numbers. It's about the strength of the banks that you have. Some countries may have just 10 banks, but the capital base of those banks are strong enough to support the economy. But it is painful, because these are banks by our own people, and for whatever reason, I think it was a good initiative on their part to invest in having banks and to end up this way. It's bad. But I think we should also admit that the signs were there for a while. I mean, by 2016, 5 billion cedis of taxpayers' money had gone into these banks to support them, yet they couldn't recover. 5 billion Ghana cedis. Indeed, by the latest count, it's about 16.58 billion cedis that has gone in. But the fact that the receiver has been able to recover 1 billion thus far, let's even assume that that figure doesn't go up. It doesn't necessarily mean that taxpayers have lost out. And I'll tell you why. Look at what happened especially in France and in the UK, and to a point in America. The government stepped in, okay, to support the banks. Later on, they sold the shares. So, for instance, the fact that CBG is now owned by the state, and CBG, by all accounts, is doing well, in 2, 3, 4 years' time, government can easily offload its shares.
Government gave that indication even at the start.
I'm just saying. So it is not just in the recoveries. Of course, that's an important part to look at. And that could take long, because a lot of these things could be in fiscal assets that perhaps they have to be liquidated and the rest of it. But I'm saying that so long as these banks, the ones that taxpayers' money have gone in, particularly including the 5 that were supported by GAT, so long as they do well, because the regulator is doing its work well, and the corporate governance structures of those institutions are also being adhered to. So long as that happens, you will see a recovery, and we've seen signs of that already. profits going up, you know. So long as that happens, we expect government, because government needs resources. We expect in the next few years, these assets or shares will be sold, and then government can then raise money, and the taxpayers' money can be used for the things that we want. Because I don't think that this government came into office thinking that it was going to throw away 16.58 billion cedis in something that was not in its manifesto.
All right.
You know, so I think really, let's not see it as a waste, even if we're not able to recover through the receiver.
Right.
But let's see it as money that, so long as those banks are doing well, they are for the people of Ghana, and they can be sold.
Thank you. Now, Doris, again, and I'd like us to focus on the solutions moving forward and how to consolidate the solutions that have already, been started. I'd like to keep to the finance minister's, statement as to 13 billion, even though it's good to have information that we are doing about 16.58 billion, right, so far. The Bank of Ghana has issued various policies and directions. Being in this particular sector, are you satisfied? And if you are not, what do you advise should be done to avoid us falling into this ditch one more time?
Thank you very much. A number of directives have since the banking debacle been issued. Notable amongst them is the recapitalization you mentioned, and I think it's gone around the room a bit, from 120 to 400. What does mean? What that actually does is that it gives you, as a bank, the financial muscle to be able to make certain maneuvers and handle it transactions. So that, on the asset side, is a good thing. Another directive that has been issued is the governance directives.
Right.
And in the area of governance, requirements such as CEOs not having to exceed 3 maximum terms of 4 years each ensures that some sanity is kept in the banking system, because you are not there forever. You are not there till you retire. So you want to make sure that you are keeping your books in order and things are transparent and efficiently run, so that whoever comes after you would not come and find skeletons in your cupboard. Another one of the directives is the requirement of auditors, for example, to be rotated. So after an auditor has been with a bank for 6 years, they are actually required to go cool off. They may be re-engaged again in the future, but that period also ensures that there isn't any collusion between the auditors and then the bank in question. There is also the fit and proper test that has been issued, which requires that before you can hold certain positions in a banking institution, either as a shareholder, meaning that you own the bank, or to hold senior management positions, or to even be on the board, that your background will be checked to ensure that you meet certain basic integrity expectations. And then there are also checks as to your level of expertise, so that you cannot just attempt to apply common sense to the banking industry, because it would backfire. These, as well as the adoption of the Basel II, Basel III framework, a closer look at how banks' capitalization is computed, how capital adequacy requirements is calculated, as well as the scope of monitoring for risk in the banking operations, I think are all laudable initiatives that I am satisfied with. In the past, when your minimum capital was 400, that was it, and you felt that you could be in any business at all. But under the new regime, depending on the kind of transactions that you are engaged in, the Bank of Ghana is actually empowered to say that we require you to add additional capital. So that's a novelty, something that I believe will ensure stability in the banking system. Also, on the risk side, when it comes to capital adequacy computation, it's not just the regular components, but now it's going to be risk-weighted. So bank by bank, we will be looking at what kind of undertakings and risk exposures you have. And based on that, the components are weighted. So it's more stringent than what we used to have.
Okay.
In the past, banks tended to focus almost excessively on credit risk. So our focus is ensuring that our credit risk regime is in order and we are compliant with the provisions. But going forward, another requirement is that we look in the space of operational risk. So what kind of risks is a particular bank exposed to as far as its day-to-day operations, human error, etc., systems? What role do they contribute to the stability of that particular bank? And then also market risk, because we operate in an environment that has a tendency to impact on us. I heard a senior colleague say once that so long as that the banking industry exhibits a lot of confidence, you don't see it in the marketplace. But as soon as confidence is shaken or touched, you begin to see the ramification throughout the economy. I believe that the provisions that have been put in place under a number of the directives that I've enumerated, as well as the operationalization of the Act 930 are followed. We should, over time, see recovery. I also believe that one thing that all banking industry participants should do going forward, in addition to the provisions that the Bank of Ghana has given, is that we all jump on board the vehicle to promote rebuilding of confidence,
Right.
because it takes time to achieve that.
Right. And we know that our economy is largely an informal economy, and the small-scale, medium enterprises were depending heavily on the microfinance and these small, finance houses. In the wake of this flood of a collapse of that sector, looking into 2020 and going forward, how will that hit the economy, and how do we avoid it?
It's a very important issue that you raise, because we've seen from the first quarter of 2017 all the way to the third quarter of 2018 that there was actual contraction in economic activity in the banking industry. Post 2018 third quarter, we've seen some growth, but you see the inertia that results from reform. Growth in economic activity in the sector has not exceeded 2%. And with election year approaching, which is a unique year, you don't expect any overnight miracles to happen. And the banks themselves also need some value retention, and that value is created by the economic activity of the likes of the small businesses that you make reference to. And so it's a tough one. However, knowing that our economy is largely informal, and therefore the conventional methods and policies and money market tools, when applied, don't achieve the desired and expected effects. We have the Bank of Ghana having recently introduced some creative policy directions that I believe would sort of help the SME sector in particular. And that is a targeted lending that permits the banks to take up to about 2% of the primary capital to lend it to the SMEs. So this, in a way, creates some bit of, should I say, comfort or buffer for the sector that has been most hit by the development in the sector.
Right. So, Bright, from where you sit and observing the development so far, how satisfied are you, and what are the positives that we can, as it were, leverage on going forward?
And this is in respect to the financial
Yes.
crisis and its aftermath.
Exactly.
So I share the view that we have seen a much more robust Bank of Ghana when it comes to implementing some of the enormous powers, some of them almost plenary powers that have been given to the regulator in Act 930 and in other laws. So certainly there is a tendency now to use the law much more robustly. I have a concern about the nature of the policy making and the way in which we debate policy in areas that are perceived to be technocratic. And I'm not in any way debasing the importance of a technocratic emphasis in an area as complicated and as regulated as banking. But I do believe that, to the extent that the academic community in this country increasingly does not comment on topical issues. So we've not had a single paper published on the banking crisis the last 2 years. I find that remarkable. To the extent that the academic community seems to have vacated that role and somewhat given it up to activist organizations like my own, I believe that technocrats, regardless of the degree of sophistication of the areas that they should pretend, have to be more open in the way that they accept feedback and criticism. Right. In the case of the Bank of Ghana, my specific area of disagreement has been in this belief that somehow with minimum equity, you can substantially minimize risk. And therefore, by raising minimum equity so substantially, almost 3.5 times, you are doing a good, you're doing a great service to the industry and to the general public, the saving public. I don't think there's any evidence for that, and we've said that several times. We've explained that when you look at the banks that have collapsed over a number of years now, there is no evidence that size is the driving determinant. And the truth of the matter is that minimum equity is primarily about size. You can dice it any way you want, but if you say that the minimum equity should be 400 million Ghana cedis or nearly $80 million, primarily what you're saying is that you want big banks. If you want to use capital adequacy ratio, on the other hand, like the way that Doris has pointed out about reducing risk weighting and things like that, to more fundamentally and more surgically try to ensure that the balance sheets of these institutions are much safer, we should do that. There is no concern on this side of the table or on the other side of the table that capital adequacy is really critical. The problem has been to confuse the two, so that even as we're trying to implement Basel Plus in some instances, so sometimes we are going beyond Basel III, some of the regulations that are being promoted. In the same time that we're doing that and focusing on risk, we're also insisting that minimum equity is the driver. And I don't just get it. Why? Because you have countries such as Switzerland, you have the UAE, so many other countries where minimum equity is in the region of single-digit millions of dollars. And I think going forward, this debate around the use of minimum equity as a risk management tool needs to be had. And if the academia is not going to take it up, activist organizations should be much more forward. We have now seen it in the insurance industry. We're probably going to see it in the pensions industry at some point. Right. And it's a blunt tool. We saw Unibank as being the bank that caused the greatest financial burden after the situation. Unibank was not a small bank. It had way in excess of the minimum equity. We had other banks like UT and the rest, who at that time also were very likely to have met the minimum equity rules. The banks like Bank of Baroda and the rest, which were niche banks, did not necessarily have solvency issues. To the extent that they did not have solvency issues, to the extent that they did not have excess risk issues, I don't understand why there's this view that you must have blanket high minimum equity. And nobody seems to be willing to have that debate. So that is a problem. Okay. On other areas that have come up for discussion, which is the concern around recoveries, as well as whether we can use a toxic asset reform program type approach, where you're not focusing purely on liquidation and recovery, but seeing whether you can take over the management of some of these institutions and run them. I think that debate is worth having. Why? Because in some instances, it's a matter of intelligence, financial intelligence. And when the company is completely liquidated and people have nothing more to lose, it becomes very difficult to do recoveries in those contexts, particularly in that type of economy, where you've taken over management in a preliminary fashion before you move on to other measures. You probably have a better chance of finding out where those assets are and to implement recovery measures that are much more sound. Right. So my view of the matter was that in some instances, yes, there was, particularly in the fund management industry, many of these companies were comatose, and they were already zombies. Right. And therefore, this was the path they should have gone. So I will focus on those two main issues, and then if you have other questions, I guess, if I have more time.
Great. So it does appear that we will also need to be told how much exactly the capital that is involved as regards the good assets that those banks that were assigned to, say, GCB Bank and to the Consolidated Bank, what's the total of the assets? Because that will also inform us to get to know how much of the taxpayers' money has already been recovered by that way.
So we know, for instance, that the finance minister was recently in parliament asking for more money. So those analysts who have said that the total cost may hit $5 billion have sound basis, because they keep coming back asking for more money. $5 billion is bigger than the GDP of the 13 smallest African economies. So this is the scale we are dealing with. It's bigger than the GDP of the 13 smallest African economies.
Okay.
So if this is the cost of it, and we know that the good access of CBG is now in the region of about $1.4 billion thereabouts, and GCB's ability to restructure some of the assets that it took over in the earlier round of the resolution actions may not exceed $600 million thereabout. Okay. Then we have a huge gap.
All right.
So I don't agree with Otchere-darko that the horizon is optimistic. It does look as if you're going to take a huge haircut as a country, because we know for now what good assets currently are in safe.
So on questions of the economic management, let me start with Gabi. Bawumia had said at the National Policy Summit in May 2017 that Ghana's economy will be formalized by end of 2017. He spoke about 3 important elements. National ID system, I suppose we have been on that project. National digitization system, and then payment systems. More importantly, interoperability, to ensure financial inclusion. When it comes to the ID system, we know that the national identification has so far registered in excess of 3.6 million Ghanaians. Question is, these are fine things, but how do they now translate into easing the burden of the people?
Well, I think, first of all, the report by McKinsey suggested that just through digitization, you can enhance revenue by about 13%. And for a country where we know that, as it were, the red tape of bureaucracy becomes even a way of people making money on the side, it can be even more than 13%. Because, for instance, if you have to buy a passport, you have to acquire a passport and you have to pay a guru boy. You have to acquire a license, you have to pay a guru boy. You have to get your things from the ports. You have to pay even the others on the side, outside of what the GRA pool is. So it's important to recognize that digitization is one of the effective tools of combating corruption and also improving efficiency. So I think that's absolutely clear. I mean, nowadays it takes about, even for the pension fund, it takes about a week or so to access it. And even if, as a new claimant, it used to take sometimes months. Now I understand it takes a couple of weeks to do so. So we are seeing the effect of that, and I'm sure Bright will have more on this than an ordinary person like myself. But, so it is important, and particularly it's a cost. I understand earlier they were talking about value for money. Interoperability, we're going to do it for what, 1.2 billion in this country. Okay? And then a new government comes in and is doing the same thing at $4.6 million. That's value for money, and you get the same results. So even the process of digitization, we were trying to find a way to use corruption and benefit from it. So so there's obviously a problem with the way we do things, but the more we reduce the human activity in the processes of bureaucracy, I think the better value for money that we can get. But you're right about the impact. I mean, I heard you say earlier that 3,000 jobs have been saved. No, there were 10,000 employees within the sector. 65% jobs have been saved so far. 6,500 are still.
And depending on the official figures as put out by the Finance Ministry.
Yes, my figures are from Bank of Ghana, so I'll probably go with Bank of Ghana.
Okay.
But my whole point is that it's actually the impact, because you could, well, of course, I mean, if you're among the 3,500 or so who have lost their jobs, it is not a good thing. But sometimes I think John Jinapor and his group should also take credit for the reforms that are happening now. It was a law passed under them, Act 930. It was the law passed when they were in office.
Okay.
And indeed, that law at Section 123 makes it mandatory for the Bank of Ghana to revoke the license of a bank or a deposit-taking institution that has gone insolvent, or in the bank's estimate, in the central bank's estimate, within 6 months will go insolvent.
Right.
And you don't have a choice with these things, and that's a law that I think they should take credit. The directives that we mentioned here earlier, all those directives are coming from Act 930. So really, we have the laws. What we need is a regulator that has the integrity, the courage, the competence, and the professionalism to do what the law wants it to do.
All right. John, do you agree that we are on the path of creating a smart economy by the introduction and the processes of ensuring these three elements are achieved? What are your concerns in this journey, and what should be avoided?
Well, first of all, the first thing is that there should be honesty. I think that as a government, we ought to be honest. You just raised the issue about even how many jobs have been saved in the banking sector. Let me just give you a quick one. Ken Ofori-Atta stated on the 31st of July that 3,000 jobs were saved. Then President Akufo-Addo, 3 months after that, says that 7,000 jobs were saved. Now, in November, we are told that GAT has saved 17,000 jobs. So the point is that you can't even trust and believe what you are told. So I think that credibility ought to be the key. The other issue, yes, it's good that we take credit in things that we do. But it's also important that when we assume the reins of government, we follow through the good policies that our predecessors started. And a clear case is this issue of PDS. A very well-conceived, good program that would have resulted in the formalization of the energy sector, digitization, so that I can even buy credit with my mobile phone. Our colleagues took that program and ran it to the ground. I think that these are some of the things that we should learn, and that we should learn to build consensus. And that even when you win power, it doesn't necessarily mean that what your predecessor was doing, everything amounts to naught. That we can learn some good things from it. We're just talking about the banking sector. We've been talking about the banks, talking about capital adequacy ratio and all that. I think we should also look at the governance aspect from government itself. I read a report from the Association of Bankers. It takes on average about 2 years for a contract awarded to be paid back to the banks. So if you have banks giving out credit to the private sector, and it takes you an average of 2 years to pay that money, it means that the banks will shy away from supporting the private sector. And if you go and read the Monetary Policy Committee reports, you see that government still dominates the whole sector in terms of credit. Government takes about 56 or 60%. And so government also ought to do its part. Gabi was talking about if the banks do well. That's a conditional statement.
Look, so if we can stay on what we are told are the three elements for creating a smart economy, and we're talking about the national ID system, what are your concerns with it? How can we avoid what is wrong in that regard? Digitization and also the payment system.
So I want to take it from the point of investment. If you look at our budget from 2015, 16, 17, 18, and 19, and you do even a trend analysis of areas where we are investing critically. For instance, in 2016, we spent 5 billion on capital expenditure. It declined to 3 billion in 2017. It declined to 3.3 billion in 2018. And then in 2019, we are doing 4.5 billion. So it tells you that even in terms of investment, where to invest. And anybody who has done some amount of economics will tell you that if you don't invest in critical capital infrastructure and you concentrate on goods and services alone, all this so-called digitization and whatever, for me, would not achieve the desired results. And so I have been to my constituency, and a lot of people can attest. Several people in my constituency have not had the opportunity of being registered. Because unlike the Electoral Commission system, where we take the centers to the various polling stations and register people, we decided to choose some centers. And for me, a lot of the people across the bank of the river couldn't. And when they come, they have major, major problems. So it might be a good idea, but the way you are implementing it, I thought that we ought to think through it. We ought to have a good process and ensure that it meets our aspirations. Other than that, all these very noble things we mentioned, even on the ground, it does not translate to real results. Because we've had about 3 years now. We're given so many promises and timelines. We've missed almost all the timelines. I think that that's an area we ought to look at so that we can bite what we can really handle.
Gabby has a quick response, and I suppose he's going to tell you about...
You know, I agree with John completely, you know, and he talks about infrastructure spend and all that, and he talks about government should also take responsibility. If you commit the state to about 17 billion cedis worth of infrastructure work, okay, and you don't have the money to pay for it as government, 17 billion. You don't know where you're going to get the money from, but you commit to it, and you get contractors on the ground. And then you've even issued certificates of 12 billion. New government comes in, they do an audit, okay, and it cuts down to 5.6 billion. Now, if that's how you are running the economy, then how are you going to pay the contractors? You know, so yes, he's absolutely right. I mean, of course, if you sign PPAs, you know, power purchasing agreements in excess of more than 20% excess in terms of your
power needs.
Absolutely. Even beyond that. Okay, in excess of 20% in terms of your reserves. And then you sign take or pay, that you have to pay 568 million. And they are all in excess. And you sign these contracts.
I hope I'm going to get the opportunity to deal with this. These are new issues.
No, but I was making a point.
No. Take it easy. Take it easy. Very, very unfair to raise false issues and not allow us to deal with them.
These are public documents. These are public documents. But my whole point is that if you're going to make an issue about a government responsibility, then you don't go issuing contracts when you don't know how you're going to pay for it. That's really what I'm saying. And of course, you don't go and sign PPAs far in excess of what the country needs, and far in excess of what the country needs to pay. So those are the issues, my comments. But it's fine.
Okay.
I was just supporting your comment.
I was supporting just a minute.
No, Gabby, yes, let's hear
him. Don't allow false figures to be thrown out here. This is Ghana's power generation capacity and power production as at September 2019.
Okay.
The electricity company of Ghana is the sole off-taker of all PPAs.
Yes.
Samson, and I quote for you, the installed capacity is here, 4,963. This is dependable capacity, 3,424. Our peak demand is 2,800. When you strike the difference and the amount of power we are exporting, Gabby's statement is false and flat. And this is what
Gabby's statement, which is basically a repeat of what Ken Ofori-Atta, the finance minister, has told the country and the world through Parliament.
Which is a repeat of what he has said today.
I have debated this on the floor.
But that's exactly what you've said.
And stated that this so-called 20% excess capacity is false. What do you mean by excess capacity? It means the capacity that is available that you don't use, you pay for. And you do that using dependable capacity. People should be educated and stop falsifying figures. Let me give you an example.
Dependable capacity?
When they came to Parliament, they requested for 500 million.
We still on the back
pay for excess capacity. Yes. We asked for the details. Do you know what they did? They went and paid Stratcon, a company that was formed by you people in 2017, 350 million for fuel supplies. What has fuel supply got to do with capacity? He talks about savings of 5 billion. But that is false. Look, that report that was commissioned by the Auditor General was done on July 2017, 6 months or 7 months after we had left office. When they requested their ministers, instead of them sending them proper records, They added everything, including what has been paid and what has not been paid. So the Auditor General did a good thing by rejecting those that have been paid. Then the president rushed to say that he has saved the nation 5 billion. What kind of lazy man's approach is this?
Well,
this is not how you do governance.
Well, okay,
this
thank
is
you.
Not how you do governance.
Thank you. And quickly, Gabby, you wanted to respond to him quickly.
I don't want to go back and forth.
Yes,
but he knows.
Gentlemen,
yeah.
To not forget that we are interested in looking at what works, the solutions going forward.
Absolutely.
Because we have spent a whole year lamenting over these issues. We don't want to rehash all of that.
It is not false that at the moment we are renegotiating with the IPPs, the country. There are renegotiations going on in terms of take-or-pay commitments that the previous government did. It is a fact. It is happening. And why do you have to go and renegotiate if it's kosher? If the contract is kosher, do you have to go and renegotiate? It is happening now. So that is not false.
Okay.
It is not false that the billions and billions of arrears left and contracts were given when they had absolutely no idea where they were going to get money from. For 2016, capital expenditure was about 300 million. Yet that same
from which budget?
I'm telling you.
This is the figure here for capital expenditure.
Sorry, John, don't
300 billion.
I'm coming.
How much is Ghana's budget?
John, please don't
to do 300 billion
million
in 2016.
How could I say
what
billion?
Is this?
How could I say billion? Please.
All right, so
no, my whole point is that yet you go and contract billions and billions of cedis. You know, of course, you want to show that roads are being built, but you can't build roads on arrears and debts when you have absolutely no clue how to pay for it.
All right.
So really, that's really what I'm talking about.
Okay.
So if a government is responsible in managing the economy, then you can do all the other things. And if you negotiate properly for the state, then you can do all manner of stuff.
Okay.
I mean, in terms of whether people benefit from contracts or not, of course, business people benefit from it. But it's the responsibility of the state to negotiate properly so we get value for money. I think that's all we're asking.
All right.
You know?
Okay, so now, Bright, as particularly your position talks about how the economic management is not sort of trickling down to the people because also there is lack of investment in capital projects, including more particularly road infrastructure. The government's approach of the 1D, 1F, we're told of 181 projects that are at various stages of implementation at this moment. We're told of 110 districts across the 16 regions that have these ongoing. Then we're told about the direct and indirect jobs that these are creating. You also have, for example, the National Entrepreneurship Initiative, which has provided training for over 15,000 people. You have over 100,000 jobs for those who are being given temporary jobs, 36 months over the period. Is this the way to continue in seeking to expand and grow the economy?
So I don't think anybody can quibble with the principles that often guide these interventions. So for instance, when it comes to industrialization, it's been a long-held dream of the Ghanaian policy and the bureaucratic elite to industrialize the country. So I don't see how anybody could quibble with that.
All right.
The challenge is almost always in the detail. That's the thing with this country. It's rarely about the headline projects or ambitions or whatever. It's always about the detail. So a very major area where we've consistently had difficulty understanding the government's position is in the area of bauxite, one of the most important mainstays of the Ghanaian dream to industrialize. It's been with us for, half a century. Then the government decides that, look, we're going to go and borrow money. So actually, we're not going to borrow money. We're going to do a barter arrangement where we're going to give aluminum, or alumina in some instances, it's not always clear which is which, to a contractor, a company called Sinohydro, and that in exchange for that, they're going to give us infrastructure. Now, the problem that arises in these kind of situations is that from a 40,000 feet, point of view, it sounds very credible and very plausible. except that when you dig into it, it makes absolutely no sense. It makes no sense because you need, first of all, to invest huge amounts of infrastructure in processing and the likes of it before you get anywhere to get in the aluminum to pay for them. It's a 10-year, 20-year dream. So if you really want roads and the likes of it, go and borrow money. Don't say that what we are going to do is take refined aluminum and give it to a company to sell, when you know the process of actually getting through that, getting the infrastructure in place. You know, let me give you an example. You remember Busai, the Chinese company that was doing bauxite for many years? We've had all of these companies try to do bauxite in this country, right? We have actually companies today that are having challenges with the tax authorities because they cannot pay their tax and the likes of it. In one instance, we nearly shut them down. If the private sector knew that bauxite was easy to do and refine and make money, they would have done that. The difficulties that arises is the massive front loading of investment in railways and the like before you can get a place like Atiwa into actual play when it comes to refined aluminum. So you're not going to be able to do it in any time sooner than a decade. It's going to take a long time to get to the level where you are producing refined aluminum in the quantities required to sell for $2 billion.
All right.
First of all, in terms of the deposits, the quality of the deposits that are there, the data that we have in terms of reserves, et cetera, from Kitson, all the way from Kitson in the early parts of the last century, it's quite evident that it's a long-term project. Why do you want to, in finance, we often talk about making sure that the timeline of the liabilities and assets are well matched. Standard risk management technique. You have a situation where you want roads in as quickly as time as 2 years, etc. Why will you not simply say, we're going to borrow money and build roads?
Okay.
Or, even if you're going to do it with Sinahydro, go for supply credit arrangement. Why will you tie that to a long-term project? So these are the kind of things where, to my mind, we always somehow forget the detail.
Right.
And then we want people to be positive about the headline. Yes, we support bauxite. We support industrialization.
Right, so
but
let me take I couldn't take your questions, only two. So I'm taking two more. One here and one there.
I think the
one here, one there. Okay, Gideon Bwako wants to make an intervention also. Yes, so let's hear you quickly, Gideon. Gideon works from the Vice President's office in dealing with matters of economy. Here, this is your microphone. Yes, branded. Very quick.
I think the first comment I have to make is on Bright's first submission on the minimum equity. And if I got it right, you tried to suggest that Bank of Ghana was basically using the minimum capital as a main risk mitigation measure, which is not right.
That's not what I said.
No, but you had indicated that debate had to be open because using that as a risk mitigation measure has a lot of issues to deal with. I don't think that is what Bank of Ghana was trying to do. There were legacy issues with non-performing loans that had pushed a lot of the banks to even breach the single obligor limit. And so, the measures Bank of Ghana had to do, part of the strategy was also to increase the minimum capital so that the banks will have adequacy of capital to be able to support what they do. And then there were other measures, and those were very well articulated by Doris. So your comment coming after Doris's comment when she had elaborated quite substantially.
Right. Okay, thank you.
The issues was a bit puzzling. The other thing you're talking about is with the bauxite. I found it quite puzzling that you are creating the impression that the idea was wrong and there's no way we're going to have bauxite mined and refined within
the right timeline.
No, but I mean, why are you talking about 2 decades and a decade? Bauxite, we have instances of countries where bauxite refineries have been established. Is it doable? Yes.
All right.
Can we do it? Do we have the resources? And so you're talking about inciting the bauxite problem. If you're going to have a bauxite mine and a bauxite refinery at the same location, there is no need to think hugely about having a 100-kilometer railway before you can do that. So those are exaggerations.
Okay.
Thank you. No, but once you refine, you reduce the quantity of what you have to export.
Thank you, Dr.
So you don't need such
Thank you very much. I'm taking one question here and one here. So if you have the microphone, please go ahead. One here and one here. I'm sorry. Okay. Yes.
Thank you. My name is John.
Once we are done, we'll allow you opportunities to ask several other questions. So yes, please go ahead.
John Zadema is the name. I'm asking this question to allay my fear just as you can see from my hair, I'm getting to the pension. In the wake of this financial crisis and the commentary coming from the various political divide, the role of the Minister of Finance cannot be taken away. But I understand the Minister of Finance is also coming as an entrepreneur, if I may put it this way, owns a bank or finance institution. And the issue is that from the opposition, that he's doing this to, as it were, enhance his job. And for that reason, when they come to power, they are going to also more or less like pay back. But the question is, if you take Data Bank as an institution and the role that they are playing as fund managers, it affects both political divide. They are, in terms of managing the tiers 2 and 3. And therefore, I want to find out, maybe from the Honorable Former Minister, whether that is the position of NDC, that when they
Thank
come
you for the
to
question.
power,
So it's to you directly,
Data
John
Bank
Jinapo. Yes, can we hear you too?
Tari Ajay, my question is two. One is...
You'll ask one question, yes.
With the regulator, how sure are we that this corporate governance that has been frauded by the banks will not reoccur again? Is there any policy credibility or policy
so Doris
direction?
can address. Thank you very much. Yes, John, how do you respond to the question?
May I inquire?
We have heard leaders in the NDC, leading figures in the NDC, suggest that's informing his fear.
Suggest that?
Yes, that if you got the opportunity to come to power, you will do something that sounds like a retaliation.
No. President Mama has been very clear that next year by now, at the transition team, at the transition team, when we are preparing to assume office on the 7th of January, it will be about nation building. It's about putting the country first.
Okay, so that's a direct answer to a direct question. Yes, Doris, the question that he asked, what's the assurance?
I think that we should take a cue from the policy credibility that the Bank of Ghana has exhibited over the last so many years. One of them being the benchmark inflation target that was set 8 plus or minus 2. And over the period, we haven't seen a breaching of that under the IMF surveillance. So I believe that they are going to stick to it. Again, I would like to make reference to the MOU currently between the Bank of Ghana and the Ministry of Finance, which brings about an end to monetary financing. And we've seen that there's been quite a lot of pressure on the, should I say, debt financing of our budget. But we haven't seen the Bank of Ghana breach this agreement. And this agreement is going to remain in force through 2020. I believe that those are signals that should give us confidence that the Bank of Ghana is exhibiting its responsibilities and performing its duties as any regulator should. You should rest assured.
Okay, thank you. And Gabi, your hand is up, but use that opportunity to address Jacob's, concern he had raised earlier. As a farmer, producer, we know about 33 of the large-scale processing plants that were supposed to come into effect in 2019. We have seen what the president has inaugurated over the period, and now there's a lot of talk about the juice factory and all of that. Interest is what is killing the local producer. That's his problem.
And he's absolutely right. Sometimes you hear that, well, you're talking about inflation is low, interest rates is low, but we can't feel it in our pockets. But the thing is, when inflation is high, you feel it in your pocket. When interest rate is high, you feel it in your pocket. When electricity prices are going as high as they were before, which was like 40% a year, you feel it in your pocket.
It's wrong.
When, of course, there was a time that people were working to pay electricity in Ghana. That's
so
what
they are not working to pay electricity.
No, they are paying, but at least
you're paying for them.
No, please.
Okay, gentlemen, I'm sorry, but
let me make a point.
Time has run so fast.
So my point is, yes, interest rates are going down. It's important. Inflation is under better control now. So all those things are important. And understand that there's a new bank coming, And the focus, and if you notice, the focus of the country per se, even with industrialization, is linked to agric.
All right.
So I think there's a lot of focus now on agric. But just one short point on the bauxite thing. I think really this Sino-Hydro deal is perhaps one of the most innovative financing arrangement that I've seen. And I'll tell you why. You said government should just go and borrow. They couldn't borrow because there was a ceiling. IMF, thanks to John Jinapor and his people, there was a ceiling as to how much you could borrow. There are things that you want to do, infrastructure that you need to develop. And government at the same time came with a vision that, look, we want to have an integrated aluminum industry. So what do? You link the two, okay? If, for instance, it takes 3-4 years, because there's a moratorium of 3 years, by which you have to start paying for this Sino-Hydro thing. As we speak, GEADEC was set up.
Right.
They have over 15 companies that have signed up, including Aqua and the big boys, miscellaneous. All of them have signed up. Okay. It can take about 22 months, 18 months to set up a refinery.
Okay, thank you very much.
We're talking about railway. You don't need railway to carry.
So in some 30 seconds, your reaction to
Yes. First of all, I mean, if a bank is hitting a single obligor limit, which means that because you have to do 25% maximum to one borrower, it does not have enough capital to do that. That's a purely business decision. You go with other banks and you syndicate the loan.
Right.
We borrow money from Cocoa Board every year borrows money from very big banks. Even those banks do syndication. So I don't understand why a small bank in Ghana will want to take a deal on their own if they have the financial markets.
But they did it.
It's got nothing to do whatsoever with the fact that you have to have a certain type of medical to do it.
All right.
Number 2 on the bauxite is very important. Remember that these are private companies. Private companies are bidding to come and partner with the government to install this
based on the law.
Given that you don't have money to do it, because that's why you're going through this route.
Absolutely.
Assume that they're going to take 90% of equity. How much profit are you going to make on that bauxite to pay your $400 million to the?
But the law,
Hydro. It makes absolutely no sense.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
To come and refine bauxite.
Right.
So you use that to pay
I suppose that guys, you understood from the very start that we are looking to the solutions going forward, and in getting into 2020, we will discuss these matters further about the solutions and not the continuing complaints about how things may have issues. Once again, a round of applause for our guest, Bright Simmons, Honorary Vice President Atimani, John Jinapor is MP Yape Kusogu, Gabi Asare Otchere-darko is Senior Partner, Africa Legal Associate, and Doris Ya Agre Anyate is Chartered Banker and CEO of Crescendo. Thank you. We take a break. We return with the next segment when Evans Mensah will be hosting the political party chairpersons and other of our distinguished guests on election matters and election violence. Of course, there's a new register that is being spoken about, and vigilantism, among others. Right after that, we shall then deal with the matters of press freedom and how this government has scored. For that issue, we are looking at the last 3 years, the scorecard. Thank you very much. A round of applause once again for my guests.
So you're still with us here at the UPSA East Wing, where we're still bringing you the special edition of Newsfile. We're just wrapping up now with our last but one conversation. This is the main one before we wrap up with the media conversation. This has to do with the politics, the elections, the vigilantism, all the key issues that we'll be talking about in quite some detail in a few days as we enter the 2020 election year. This year has been a major year when it comes to elections reforms. Particularly, we have a law for the very first time that attempts to regulate and deal with politically related violence, as it has to do specifically with vigilantism. And has this law worked since it was enacted, signed into law in July this year? And what are the political parties doing themselves to help make this law effective? as we approach 2020. My guest in the studio with us here at UPSA on this in this auditorium is the General Secretary of the New Patriotic Party, the governing party, Mr. John Bodu. Grateful that you could join us. Also joining me is Professor H. Kwesi Prempeh, who, of course, is the Executive Director of the Center for Democratic Development. And Kofi Abuchi is the past Dean of GIMPA, is also a private legal practitioner, a partner at Access Legal Solicitors. We were built to have some of Hussam Poffo join as the National Chairman of the National Democratic Congress. Just been told in my ear that he has an emergency, and so he's been replaced by Mr. Osei Kwame Griffiths. He's the Director of IT for the National Democratic Congress. Mr. Griffiths, thank you for your time also in the conversation. But I want to start with Mr. John Bodu on his own assessment of how this year had been for the NPP. I know he started the year with the tragedy, I guess, of the Ayawaso West Wuogon by-elections. We were all subjects to the Ayawaso West Wuogon Commission of Inquiry, of which Mr. Kofi Abuchi was the Executive Secretary. You appeared before the commission yourself. I also did. What's your own assessment of that period? It was a very difficult period for politics in this country.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that we've done very well as a nation. Gone were the days where people think that multi-party democracy necessarily breeds conflicts and rancor. And as a result, it's the reason for most takeovers of our democratic culture. If you recall, from 1992 to date, apart from few instances, particularly on by-elections, where most actors congregate, national to the lowest level, and as a result of primarily our inability to protect ourselves, and the fact that there are few sanctions to people who exact or want to take the law into their own hands over the period, you realize that it serves as an incentive for people to misbehave over the period of time. So I'm particularly happy about the fact that when it happened this time around, it has happened before. We've had Otchere-darko by-elections. You saw security operatives shooting in the midst of crowd. Had it not been the presence of Professor Bob Boatin in Otchere-darko, we'll have been telling different stories as we speak now. It happened in Equatia. It has happened over the period. So for a president to take action, apart from denouncing it, apart from even the political party itself, the New Patriotic Party condemning it, we went the extra mile in setting up this commission made up of prominent people in this country, including yourself and Prof, to go into it. They did their work. They presented their reports. Even along the line, the president even went further, knowing very well that we already have laws that also look into it in terms of people doing what they don't have to do, for instance. But the president thinks that if you consolidate all into an act, reading together with the other related offenses, for instance, it will help. But beyond that, he also recognized that the main political parties, NDC, MPP, irrespective of the availability of the law, need also to do more. So President called on the political parties to start talking to each other. We did so under the auspices of National Peace Council. We've met, and the final meeting, unfortunately, just as the national chairman was supposed to be here and he's not here, it's the same thing. We were to meet a week before they, at their instance, they asked for the meeting to reschedule to another date, even in the morning that they were supposed to be there. They decided not to be there at all. But we took far-reaching decisions, because before then we had together taken certain decisions in the direction of making sure that, one, we should publicize the Vigilantism Act, to let people understand what it means and the consequences of going against the law. We should also, as political parties, not provide a buffer or a shield for our members who engage themselves or get themselves in such acts. We should also be able, on our level, set some code of conduct, just as we do most often. And during elections, you realize that there will be the industry of peace industry rises, you know, at that time. We should be able to have a functional code of conduct and a standing committee, so to speak, by the political parties, right from national to the polling station, identifying or getting early signals of possibility of such groupings existing and finding ways of resolving it, and also strengthening and helping the security agencies to so to speak, solve some of these problems. So these are some of the activities that, as political parties, I'm happy that the NDC joined us in the first meeting to agree that we are not going to harbor, we are not going to hide, we are going to denounce people in our political party or in political party related violence, and make sure that we don't provide a buffer or a shield for them. And I think that it's well.
Three key things happened this year relating to that. So there was the Peace Council-led talks, which was supposed to draw out a roadmap. That roadmap is still in limbo. We understand that there's disagreement over its wording and what it should say. Then there's a law, which has been passed. Its implementation is a different question we'll look at shortly. And then there is obviously the Ayawaso West Wuogon by-election report and the white paper. And that's where I want to focus this a bit more, because since the white paper was issued, I'm curious to know what level of implementation has happened, if at all. I mean, remember your take on that. I mean, it was such a big deal having the commission for the first time to look into election-related violence. It went on for a long time. Kofi and his eminent, commissioners came together, put together a good report, got to the executive, put a white paper together that rejected a lot of the things and a lot of controversy. But even those that were accepted, it's what, several months in, the year is almost ending. I haven't had any concrete step taken to implement some of the very far-reaching recommendations. What's your own assessment of that going into an election year?
Well, I think the idea of the commission when it was established was very welcome. The composition instilled a lot of confidence in people, and we all were very happy that the president had taken the step to establish an independent panel to investigate the Ayawaso West Wuogon issue and make recommendations. I think the aftermath of the commission's work, and of course the commission sat publicly, many appeared before it, CDD made representations before the commission. I think the aftermath was a bit anticlimactic and somewhat disappointing. We had expected that the government would take on board many more of the recommendations than it took. And especially, I think, because, as John has also mentioned, I mean, this culture of impunity had built up over many years. We also thought that it was an opportunity, to use the implementation of some of the Commission's report to signal basically zero tolerance of this kind of behavior. And the Commission did make certain recommendations along those lines, where certain identified persons were fingered as having been behind that. And there was some expectation that the appropriate legal processes would then commence for those persons to be brought to book. The fact that that has not happened and that did not happen is somewhat disappointing, especially in light of the law, right? So here is a law that criminalizes I mean, that behavior is already criminal, I mean, basically, but enhances the sentencing for participating in that kind of an activity. Not vigilantism in the ordinary sense of the word, but using violence to attain those political ends. So we thought that if that's where we're going, if we're trying a new legal solution to this problem, then the Commission's report offered us an opportunity to actually show good faith, you know, exhibit some good faith and say that, look, this is the kind of behavior that this law is trying to deal with, and it was already criminal behavior when you did it anyway. So the Commission recommends we prosecute you, so we'll go ahead to do it. I think that the fact that there is that law that tries to put criminal penalty to these things, and yet a portion of the Commission's report that would have given us an opportunity to signal that commitment, you know, that we threw out that bit and then went ahead with the law, seems to give mixed signals. And we were not happy to see that. But I think at the root also, you know, not that the law is not useful, but the fundamental problems driving this are largely political, right? There are political drivers of this tendency towards violence in our elections. Those guys who partake in this activity don't just get up to do it. There are particular motivations, there are particular things that are set in motion, there's an environment that is created that enables that to happen. So I think trying again, you know, going back to my point about the toolkit, the law is good, it's fine, right? Fine legal tool is one of the solutions possibly, but what about the other more fundamental drivers of the problem? Otherwise, it would look like you are putting Band-Aid on a cancerous sore, right? I mean, the problem is not the open sore, right? There's a fundamental problem that is within the body. And if you put Band-Aid on it, it might just, you know, make it look good, but it doesn't really solve the problem. So I think, again, there's some mixed signals about it. And we're also disappointed that once again, an attempt at dialogue between the parties, well-intentioned, has also faltered, you know. And this inability of our two parties to find common cause on some of these very grave national issues is also disturbing. I mean, each time we enter an election year with a lot of trepidation about, you know, anxiety about possible violence, we almost always avert it, fortunately, but we almost always get to the precipice before we step back. And, you know, one of these days, we may not be lucky. You know, so I think, you know, when you look at the problem of vigilantism, it's of course only a fiscal it's a physical manifestation of an underlying tone in our politics that is quite incendiary. The tone of our politics is not very civil. It is very muscular. It is very bellicose. And so it is not surprising that from that kind of tone and language, we see a translation sometimes into the physical. All of these are factors that enable it. And I think that we must just basically just, you know, just compress this. You know, just be a bit more civil in the kind of conversation we have. Civil in the way in which we disagree, like when we come here, you know, looking at the banter between Ablakwa and Edichum. I mean, that is the kind of politics we must have. The kind of conversation between John Jinapor and Gabi. Yes, parties must disagree. I mean, they disagree fundamentally about issues. Fine. But there has to be a civil way of having that conversation. You know, and when we let the tone of the politics get too incendiary, then we also signal to our supporters that it is probably okay to go the next step. And of course, because of impunity, these things have happened over and over again. So I think, on the whole, as we enter elections, we are hoping that the other activities that were supposed to support the law, that the dialogue will resume, some agreement will come early in the quarter, first quarter, about what to do about these various vigilante groups. The law is still not it's still not sufficient. There are still problems with, there are people who have doubts about even the efficacy of the law to achieve that kind of objectives. What's a vigilante? They just drop the name and morph into something else. They say, well, I'm not a vigilante, I'm not, So there are all kinds of question marks about the law. But I think political consensus between the two parties to basically just tame the language, tame the muscular tone, tame the incendiary tone of our politics is something that we need to do.
You raised a very important. I see you did some research recently that talked about how these groups have now gone into communities. And when you speak to the parties now, they say they are no longer vigilante groups. They are community-based. They help build boreholes, etc., etc. Let me bring in Griffiths. Mr. Griffiths, are you satisfied where we are on the dawn of another election year, that in the wake of Ayawaso, we have rectified the problems that led us where we were, that in 2020, we are ready to have an election free of violence?
No, not at all. I would start by defining the problem. The issue of violence in politics and political vigilantism that has engaged the media and the country at the moment has come about as a result of the occurrences of Ayawaso West Wuogon. So we believe as a political party that any solution that is prescribed, whether through law or by the dialogue between the MPP and the NDC, through the auspices of the National Peace Council, should be able to prevent the occurrence of Ayawaso West Wuogon. If it fails to do that, then it is not adequate, going into 2020 elections. To begin with, the problem and the occurrence of Ayawaso West Wuogon is the recruitment of political vigilantes into the national security apparatus and the deployment of same to intimidate, to maim, and to harass political opponents during an election, a by-election. And as I speak to you now, people have been very badly affected by it. Some cannot walk, and families have been torn apart as a result of that. This is what necessitated the commission, which we commend the president for putting together. However, we also want to note that over 2/3 of the recommendations of the commission have been rejected through a white paper by this government. The likes of Double and ASP Azugu are still free people walking about. The white paper stated, regrettably, that the violence meted on a sitting member of parliament more or less was warranted because it was provoked, as if provocation is an excuse for committing crime in this country. So we believe that when the president also came out to say that we should engage as two political parties, MPP, NDC, the NDC thought that it was not adequate for just the chairman of the MPP to write to the chairman of the we have a venue and sit and talk about political vigilantism, but it was necessary to have it regulated, to have it more or less, put under somebody that could more or less mediate.
Which is what you eventually had.
Yes, which we eventually had.
Just as looking forward, if you look into the, what will be your proposals to fix the problem? Since you say the problem hasn't been fixed.
Yes.
What will be your proposal? I mean, I think the problems with the process leading, I think is being articulated. What will be your proposal to fixing the problem, to avoiding the violence that we all expect might happen in 2020?
Well, first of all, the vigilantes that have been recruited into the national security apparatus, as recommended by the Emil Short Commission, should be disbanded. But what are we seeing? We rather see further training of such people like Otchere and other military installations. And let me say this, as somebody who has actually, been involved in some way with, have some military experience, that there's a reason why the soldier's life is so regimented. You know, there's a reason why you go through basic training, you know, and some of the most painful times in my life is my basic training, and then afterwards, some engagements that happen within the military. Before you put a weapon in the hands of anybody, you know, that person must have the discipline to know when to engage, because there are rules of engagement. It must have the discipline to know when to engage and when not to. There are international conventions that governs how deadly forces must be used. One that comes in mind is the deadly force triangle. That tells you that if somebody has the opportunity, the capability, and the intent to engage, you know, use deadly force, you have the right to in self-defense. So if we decide that, okay, you have recruited your vigilantes because you have passed a law that says nobody can, and the NDC, we are a very peaceful party. We don't owe any of these vigilantes good. Let me make that point very clear. I know the CDD has come out with a report that has named some groups, but they are around certain individuals within the party, and we have stated clearly that no, the party is not, has not formed any of these groups. We do not support any of these groups, and we have demonstrated that through our primaries from the branch level, where we have discouraged the use of these groups, right from branch level to constituency to national and the parliamentary primaries that, you know, that are almost concluding. Where there have been a few incidents, we have left the police, who we believe, you know, have a mandate to ensure law and order in this country, you know, to deal with the situation, you know. So unlike a situation where you have people harass and beat up a certain officer, a police officer at the Jubilee House, and instead of focusing on that issue, we are rather looking at punishing the person who may have leaked some tape that gave the evidence that such a thing had occurred. And where you have a whole regional security coordinator driven out of office, and the videos are all over the place.
So these are issues that, so your first solution is that take the people that you've recruited out of the service?
Yes.
Okay, and then what will be the other proposal?
Well, once you do that, then enforcement of laws. The issue of vigilantism has to do not necessarily the lack of laws in this country. It has had to do with the enforcement of the laws and the cover that these people get under the political parties. So first of all, their laws must be enforced. Whether it existed before, it has just been created. It has to be enforced.
Regardless of which party.
Regardless of who.
Okay. I want to come to Kofi Abuchi. Mr. Abuchi, so I left you for last because now you're no longer the secretary. The white paper had gone out on your report. We are really at the time when we're going into an election. I just wonder, based on all that you've heard and you really are the heart of the work, whether you're confident that the work you did is adequate to help fix the problem going into an election on the back of the white paper.
Well, I think we have to separate them. It's hard to put them together.
Okay, I know.
Because the white paper is an opinion. It's the constitutional statement on the report, but in the process, it's an opinion of the issuer. So the white paper, as has been issued, is the opinion of government in respect of the findings of the commission. It's also important to understand, and I've listened to a lot of discussion. I have refused interviews on this out of courtesy for a variety of reasons, and you are chief culprit in that.
Yes.
You know, constantly trying to get me to say something on this, but I've refused out of courtesy. But just to clarify, the government can state its opinion on the report. The government can reject the report. Again, that represents its opinion, but the rejection does not destroy the report. So there are two separate things. The findings of the Commission of Inquiry under Article 280 constitutes its equivalent to a High Court order or a High Court judgment. The same way you can't destroy a High Court judgment by rejecting it. I can say the High Court judgment is wrong. That is me rejecting it and basically expressing an opinion on that. But it doesn't destroy it. The report still stands, or the order of the High Court still stands. So just to disaggregate it in terms of your question of whether it is effective, the findings of the Commission of Inquiry, therefore, the short commission, therefore, stands for purposes of the constitutional effect. Now, this is important because this is not the first time. It's actually happened over the years. I remember, I think there was a famous report, the one involving the late Mr. P.V. Obin.
Yeah.
Involving some assets, Shraj and all that. I remember there were lots, a portion of that report was rejected. But the effect of that moment is the same as today. And for many people, once the government rejected it, that was the end of the story. No, that finding against Mr. P.V. Obin at that time stands till today as the judgment of the High Court in terms of equivalence. So it's important to understand this constitutional aspect of things. Now, I need to also state this, that the commissioners have not authorized me to say this, but I can say it with authority, that the commissioners were at great pains to make specific findings against certain individuals because these persons were acting on behalf of the state. These persons purportedly acted in good faith when they did what they did. Some of them may have put their lives in jeopardy in the line of duty for the things that they did on behalf of the state. The commissioners were therefore not primarily motivated by liability per se. If you read the totality of the report, the commissioners were mainly motivated by structural and systemic reforms moving forward. So a chunk of the report itself, in fact, more than 70 to 80% of the report was devoted to reform moving forward. It was just a small bit. But again, in Ghana and from the media perspective, the media can always be accused of this because you are more interested in what makes the news. So the focus was more on who has been found guilty for what and all that. Yes. That was looking into the past. That is already gone. The commissioners were motivated mainly by structural and systemic changes, and of course they recommended certain liabilities against certain people for which action was intended to be taken. So the most important thing for us to remember is this. As we enter 2020, and again, as I tie that into your question, as we enter 2020, December elections, we should be worried about the weaponization of our elections. We have had our elections weaponized for close to 2 decades. When we have had a normalization to a point of people accepting that when it's time for election, a group of people will call bandits, I will call bandits. Many of them are bandits because they operate typically like that. Show up at an electoral grounds, basically just lay hands on the ballot box and disappear. Some ballot boxes have disappeared from Ghana, never to be seen till today. And we have accepted this as normal. And the parties are competing in this respect on the extent to which they can be violent. In other words, who can be more violent than the other? We will call that a race to the bottom. As Mr. Griffiths has said, the parties don't own them. But if you don't own them, don't accept their acting in your name. Because as I sit here, if someone goes out there and starts calling himself my name and describing himself in a manner that fits me, and goes around misbehaving in a way that I know is improper in accordance with my expectation of my personality, and I still watch on, I will be imbued with having given that person the impression of legitimacy. What we have had as we speak at the moment is a gradual weaponization of our election, the normalization of violence, electoral violence, and as we enter 2020, my worry is we have the same criticisms coming up. Now, they start normally with the criticism. So, Mr. Griffith's worry, I will expect that Mr. Boyd will respond to that. In other words, the worry of, you mentioned some training somewhere, I think you mentioned yes, right? And we had media reports about that. True or false, I don't know. Nobody knows it. Now, that will provide the, quote and unquote, the legitimacy and the excuse for a response. So the danger I worry about, especially as we go into 2020, is that the very things that the Ayawaso Commission was supposed to stamp out, particularly in respect of some of the structural changes, some of the systemic changes, some of the cultural attitudes to election that should change. All those things, and particularly because of the way the media has responded to the government white paper, I think we are losing track of the Commission's report and a chunk of the things that are contained in there. The sad part is if we are not careful, it will gather dust. The Commission was also motivated by diction, language, labels. In my experience, and I've mentioned this before, the name given to an entity, a person, or practice is important. It makes a huge difference in the lives of that entity. And I've always cited the example of female genital mutilation. Because I remember in the 90s, when this practice became topical, the initial name was female circumcision. Nobody cared about female circumcision because male circumcision is a good thing. You know, well, I'm sure Mr. Boydu is reacting, but the biology says it's a good thing. Well, you know, we can debate that. But generally, female circumcision as labeled was not a problem until the name changed from circumcision to mutilation. Gradually, everybody and people who were associated with mutilation, with circumcision, and people actually argued for circumcision when it was called circumcision. But the moment they started calling it mutilation, nobody argued for it. The naming of an entity or a thing or practice is important. The commission took the view that calling it vigilantism is a problem or it's problematic. And I still hold the view, and the commission I think still holds the view. Well, there's no more commission, but the commission held the view that calling it vigilantism is problematic. Because when you open into the dictionary to check the meaning of vigilantism, one aspect of the meaning is that vigilantism is a positive intervention into a practice which is considered deviant or a vice by a person who otherwise has not been employed for that purpose. Therefore, you hear of the fact that there are murders ongoing, and you think you have enough, police strength and know-how to fight that, and you actually start fighting the supposed murderers, and you're able to bring people to book. Even though you are not the police, your action, which will be deemed as vigilantic, will be deemed as good, because you have intervened positively in the life of something. Once we call these political actors vigilantists, in the main, we have accepted to a point that what they're doing is good. But tell me, electoral security is fundamentally that of the police, the Ghana Armed Forces who are co-opted, allied security agencies, and then all of us who should ensure that we do not intervene in the process negatively. Allowing a group of people who have been trained by the political parties and whom, as Mr. Griffith said, they don't own them, and indeed I think both parties have said this, they don't own them, but they know them. And I think, one leading MPP activist, NPP actor, said they know them. In other words, the parties know them, and they know the parties, and they know the people who own them. And they accept implicitly that on that day, they may intervene on their behalf, and it's okay. I think that we should go beyond public denunciation. The parties must take active steps to ensure that these entities do not act in their name. Because my fear is that in 2020, we may have a repeat of Ayawaso. Yeah. So the last point I would want to make here, and this again goes to the parties respectfully, particularly the two parties. Article 55 of the Constitution requires that political parties in Ghana must be organized along democratic lines. Any party that accepts electoral violence, either actively or tacitly, has violated the spirit of that provision. Because democratic lines implies that you accept the police powers of state. Any entity that is set up to provide rival security, which is not recognized by the police entities of state, is setting up a rival authority to the state. That is a violation of the democratic expectation of political parties. So my expectation as we go into 2020, and I'm glad the NPP, I think, started the process, especially through the government, and the NDC was invited to the table. I think that the parties must publicly demonstrate a denunciation of these parties, and not just that. If any entity acts in the name of either of these parties should be seen to make an official police report and facilitate the process leading to the arrest of these entities. Because we are going to see a repeat of Ayawaso in 2020 if we don't go beyond the rhetoric.
Thank you very much. I want to get my audience involved. I'll come back to John Boydu shortly. I'm just taking 4 contributions or questions, just 4. And I'll come back to John Boydu, and I'll talk briefly with him on his reactions and also the register that's going to be compassed. So 4, just 4. Yes, sir. Your name. And very brief, 30 seconds, no more, no less. I'll catch you if you go beyond 30 seconds. I'm sorry. Let's go.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Idi Moayudin. I think with respect to the political vigilante groups associated with political parties, I think there's no debate about that. The political parties themselves have come up boldly.
You have a question?
Yes.
Or is it a contribution?
Well, it's kind of contribution.
Okay, good. So make it.
My concern really is the bit about the enforcement, the enforcement of the laws. In other jurisdictions, we see laws as enforcement. In Ghana, we see it as that of enactment. I really, if we are to go strictly by both the letter and the spirit of our laws, we probably would not even need a Vigilante Act.
So you are for enforcement?
The legal, because we have all the laws.
Thank you very much.
But the bit about the enforcement is where the difficulty is.
So, yes?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Daniel Blizananjuna from Daimok. My question is to the erudite Kofi Abuchi with regards to Commission of Inquiry. To what extent can the police or whatever investigative body secure evidence outside the testimony of a witness before a Commission of Inquiry for prosecution? Because we all know, and being guided by JSC Mafusau's ruling, the famous Ghana 50 ruling, that you cannot use a witness evidence or whatever he gives before the commission.
I think that question is very clear. Let me take you.
Thank you very much. My name is Obin Daniel. As we are discussing about this political vigilance, in fact, integrity is something very key. Of course, our senior representative from the other political party or NDC did not help us in this political discussion, because you cannot tell us, the whole Ghana or the whole world, that NDC rather doesn't have political vigilance, but then they do recognize that there is another party that has a political, that is quite, I mean, the integrity here or the credibility here, I mean, it's quite questionable. Because it is very clear. Chief Azoka has spoken. We saw even their former Interior Minister, Honorable Makoyongo, even stating something. I mean, this is quite clear. Honorable Joseph Yamin is on
you don't believe that statement.
I mean,
thank you very much. Yes, sir.
I'm here for Toby.
Yes, sir.
I want to ask this question about what's happening at the IOS West Wagon. It has been a serious problem in the country, and it is something that, if you are not careful, it will disturb the peace of this country. Now, I want to ask, my question is thrown to Honorable John Budu. The MEP is in power. What measures are they putting in place to ensure that these laws are enforced, the law that has been enacted?
Especially for ahead of 2020.
Yeah, ahead of 2020.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Final one, yes.
Thank you, sir.
Oh, time is up.
Oh, time is up.
No, you can't go, but he can't.
You see, my point is, everybody is saying the law must work. The law must work. Who should work? The judiciary, the security agency.
Speak into the microphone for me, please. Yes.
I'm saying that the judiciary must sit up. It's not, they are not there for only the vulnerables, those who still maybe plantain or whatever. Yes. But politicians too are part of it. Unfortunately for us Ghanaians, after elections, whatever went on just is swept under the carpet, and then we only render apology. Oh, we are sorry. So now everybody knows that if I work hard, fight hard, and win power, that's all I can do. Everything. So Ghanaians must sit up. The judiciary, the security agencies, and all Ghanaians must sit up and resist those kind of behavior.
Okay,
so
thank you very much. John Woodley, that's a question to you, and also you can respond to that.
I think that in looking at the problem, we were minded with the enforcement of the law, which is good, it is positive. And government needs to strengthen our law enforcement agencies. Government and parties must also desist from interfering in these things that happens. For us in the New Patriotic Party, we don't benefit in any way the groupings that tend to protest us as a result of lack of protection when we are attacked. I've had experience, practical experience, where group of people in a Sutifi, I was lucky we're close to a police station. If it had been any other place, the story would have been different, you understand? And this is something that has been going on. Sometimes if you are sitting like this, though you are not part of that process, you talk very smoothly. It is good, stop it. But if you get involved and you are attacked, that very day, had it not been, I don't normally work with security people. I don't normally work with a lot of people. That day, I don't know why I decided when I got to Kumasi to ask some of our party activists to follow me to a Sutifi. It was also because a day or two before, a policeman had been beaten by some of these thugs who were preventing students from registering. That was my luck. So like you are saying, the name itself doesn't connote negativity. It's the excess of the use of it or taking the law into your hands that makes it negative. I cannot see how political parties, as part of our process, will not have some of our activists serving us. Like you're saying, what sense does it make for any individual born of a woman to walk to a polling station and pick ballot box and vote with it? What sense does it make? But it happens. So are you saying that political parties will sit down? I remember in 2000 and...
But that's why the police is there.
I remember, you see, sometimes if you don't even know the capacity of the police, you end up concluding wrongly. I remember I went to Tamale as part of monitoring registration exercise and saw that they are case registering. There was a single policeman sitting there. I asked, policeman, don't you see that these are people who are not at the age of 18? He said, if you have eyes, go and sack them. You can imagine what will have happened. That MPP person sacks somebody who is an NDC person registering, or you will have seen what will have happened. So it is not very easy like that. I think that it is important. The last contributor mentioned the role of the judiciary. It's very, very critical. If these things happen, get the police even exact arrest, get to the judiciary, and it delays. I can cite a typical example about in 2015. Our offices, our headquarters was vandalized. A lot of our information was taken away. Thankfully, we arrested the people. As we speak now, it's still in court. I'm not saying that we must sidestep the rules and regulations and all that, but if we see expeditiously some of these cases that come before them is being dispensed with, and people are given the exact punishment to serve as deterrent, it will be helpful. I don't know, Griffith, we don't determine how the national security or the police or the army recruits their people. If it is true that you have an information, which is important for all of us, because the police or the army are institutions that does not belong to the New Patriotic Party. So if you know a vigilante group or an individual who is not qualified based on your judgment, because on what basis are you saying that they are recruiting people and training people, and so that alone is wrong? If you know, I think that will help ourselves in making appropriate report to appropriate institution for us to deal with. I can assure you, for us in the New Patriotic Party, we don't gain at all. But we must be honest and truthful. For us to say that as for our political, we don't own them. These are young party people who, for reason of lack of protection by our political activists, opt on their own. Because I remember, for instance, there's no political architecture or campaign strategy by any political party by not providing support group at the polling station level.
But your agent should be enough.
The agent cannot be enough. If the agent needs something, if the agent is attacked at the polling station, and the police is incapable, it's not a question of if the police are capable of dealing with these issues. If the police are capable of effecting arrests, if in the shortest possible time these arrests are dealt with, I think that it will serve as deterrent for people who want to do that.
I'll bring you in. Kofi makes the point that the party should be instrumental in facilitating the arrest and prosecution of these individuals who you know are your members who may have taken the law into their own hands, acting under the umbrella of vigilance.
I can assure you, it hasn't happened in this country before. also West Wogon is not the only example of electoral violence in our country.
I mean, at least, are you committed to do that?
Fantastic, because if we were not, wouldn't have even set up such a commission to go into the far-reaching report and advice and the way forward that the commission gave us. So for us as a party, we support the president and believe that the needed logistics by institutions that are expected to ensure peace and order in our country should be provided for them to be able to do their work. And we would denounce, as we've said, I have issues that I have had cause. I haven't seen any political party doing that before. I have had cause to issue statements denouncing some of these activities that are associated with our party people. And I think that we'll continue to do so. And we will continue also to expect the public to also support us in identifying and also encouraging the police to do what they must do. And if it gets to the law enforcement agencies or the judiciary, expeditious delivery of justice will also be helpful.
Kofi, final comments on what you just said?
No, I understand what you're saying, and I understand the practical realities of things too. His worry is the typical, criminological worry of someone saying, I will commit an offense or I may commit an offense because I'm expecting the other person to commit an offense. So let me do it first. And this is the reality. And it's not just, it's between the parties. You see, there's an expectation on the part of both parties that one may do it, so I have to do it. I think John puts it in right perspective when he said the architecture of the parties reflect that, both parties. So it's true that both parties actually expect that somehow, if you don't send your quote-unquote vigilantes there, your party vigilantes there, the other party is likely to send it. And if they send it and we don't send it, then they can hold sway in that particular electoral ground. So if the parties can have an understanding with good faith, the problem is the good faith, an understanding with good faith that come December 2020, one, we shall work to support the police. Two, even if we have any organized groupings in our midst, they are not going to be weaponized. Three, if we have such groups who are not weaponized, these groups will be made to work through the police. And ultimately, we are going to ensure that we bolster the security there as opposed to basically taking laws into our own hands. The point I'm just trying to make is the expectation that one side is likely to misbehave, and by reason of which we have our own reactive strategy in place. And as soon as we hear even of the slightest suspicion of something happening on the other side, we quickly also go in and do our own thing. That's the chaos which I worry about. And again, my worry stems from the fact that both parties expect that the other is likely to do something. So they'll do first.
Mr. Griffiths, final thoughts on this, especially looking ahead, solution focus. You've had some of the conversations already. What do we do to get ready for 2020?
Well, before then, let me quickly react to my friend here, a statement that he made that I indicated that none of these groups have been in any way affiliated.
It's owned by the party.
Yes. And whilst he was doing that, he mentioned individual names of people around which these groups revolve. And that is exactly what, I'm sorry if I had misinformed him, but that is exactly what I was saying.
So you said that there are individuals in your party who...
Yes, and
but
we
not
have
the party as an institution.
Yes, and we have since, especially, the occurrence of the Ayawaso West Wagon, issue statements after statements, discouraging the, these groups from revolving around these individuals. Where some of them have, made statement publicly. We've hauled them to the Functional Executive Committee, and I can cite the example of Honorable Joseph Yamin.
He was called and was sanctioned?
Yes, actually. He apologized and then... but so let me say that... Let me say that Mr. John Boadu also indicated that perhaps if I am aware of any group that are being trained anywhere, I should make that
provided to the police for investigation. So that
first of all, it is very clear, and it was part of the report, that the group that came under the cover of police SWAT team, it's an illegal and unconstitutional group and has to be disbanded.
By who? It was a recommendation.
It was a recommendation. That's very important to take note of. Now, we are all also aware of individuals who were captured before the 2016 elections. I mean, today, in today's world of, let me say, the new media, social media and what have you, You cannot hide a lot of things. Their faces were captured in T-shirts of Invincible Force and the Kandahar or whatever the names are. And these same faces have now appeared in uniforms, interestingly, embarking on operations where they have ski mask, which is usually used when you want to hide your face or you are working under extreme, weather, and therefore was necessary to, protect yourself. So as much as we can pretend that, these people were not vigilantes who have been recruited into the national security apparatus, the evidence speaks for itself.
Okay, you all have the final word on this. Obviously, from the conversation, it appears we are not ready yet for a violent-free election period. For some reason, all the things we put in place, the dialogue, the law, the sense that it hasn't been adequate to deal with it. It makes me worry. I mean, what would be your own proposal then?
Well, I think the parties ought to understand that we are at a point in our democracy where large segments of our population are beginning to lose faith in the parties. Evidence of it, the recent failed referendum. This, in my view, is one of the most painful episodes for me this year, because I was a very loud, known yes person, but I understood the sentiment from the other side, that we are tired of these parties, they only bring chaos and confusion and violence and all of that. It was very painful for me to see us lose a great opportunity, a historic opportunity to advance our democracy and decentralization in this country just because a very large segment of the population just decided to rise up against this whole importation of parties to local level. I thought it was an unfortunate thing. We've lost a great opportunity. I hope we return to it at some point. But the message is very clear that people are getting really tired of the parties and their misbehavior, especially in the areas of vigilantism. So our democracy needs to take note of that and realize that this is a turning point. It does also tell me that citizens are not as helpless as they think they are, or as we think we are, that in fact, we can use the power of the vote also to punish parties that we think are encouraging violence. Because that is not what democracy is about. I mean, if you form a party because you think you have great ideas that given power, you can transform the country. I don't think either party can tell us that they love Ghana so much that even if it means using violence, they will use it to get power so that they will make Ghana better. No. Once you begin to use violence, and once you begin to subscribe to the use of violence, it bespeaks ill motive. It shows that you want power for reasons other than transforming the lives of Ghanaians. So I think that people too must not feel so helpless, that in fact if you feel that a particular party or candidate is behaving in ways that are dangerous to our democracy, that you should be able to use the same power of the vote that you use to elect them to diselect them. Yeah. And I think the police too need to really just not sit there and say they are totally helpless. It is your job to provide security at the polling booth and the polling stations. And this idea that, well, the vigilantes have these big patrons and these, all of that could be true, but you still have to do your job as the police. Yeah. If you arrested somebody and they didn't prosecute, then we would see that you did your job and then the political parties were the ones who failed. But don't just sit there, look at all of this stuff happen, do nothing, and then, because I think everybody must play their role, is what I'm saying. Citizens must play their role, the police must play their role, the parties must play their role. And for me, I think that this whole failed referendum thing was a wake-up moment for me, that we are getting to a point where we might be putting our democracy in jeopardy if people begin to lose faith in such numbers just because they think parties are misbehaving. Yeah. And some of the things they said about parties almost make it look as if parties have done nothing good for the country since the Fourth Republic. There's a lot of good that has happened in our democracy thanks to political parties. But this bit of it, this vigilantism bit of it, is causing people to just lose faith and would one day throw the baby away with the bathwater if we're not careful.
Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for my audience, for my panelists. Thank you very much. H. Kwesi Prempeh, Mr. Kofi Abuchi, Mr. Griffiths, and John Boyd, the General Secretary of the NPP. And there are a few of you who won books. I want to quickly go through the name: Ebenezer Boama, Charles Adote Alote, Swaka Mohammed, Nuruddin Mohammed, Seth Otchere, and Jacob Ishan. You came here very first to arrive, the first 6, and as Manasseh Azuria, when he had promised, you get some of his books. In fact, the 4th John, The Voice of Conscience, and Letter to my Future Wife. And so just see Manasseh Azuria and pick your prize. Thank you very much. When we return after this particular break, we're going to have a short few minutes to look at the media going forward. As you've heard already, the next year election is going to really be dependent on what the media does with our political friends in the game of partisan politics and civil society as well. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about that. And so thank you for staying, and a big round of applause for yourself again.
Yeah, thank you.
We're still on Newsfile. This is your most authoritative news analysis platform, and this is the very final edition, special edition, end of year edition, coming to you live from the UPSA, and this is one of its auditoriums at the East Wing of the UPSA here at Legon. Thank you very much. And in the next segments, we are dealing with the media and trying to check a scorecard of some sort, what this particular regime, the NPP regime, has been able to do in the period. My guest to do that, Suleimana Brahima, is the Executive Director of the Media Foundation for West Africa. Thank you for joining us, Sule. Right. Now, also here is Liz Heffron Asari, and she is a journalist and media consultant. Thank you very much for making time for us, Liz.
Thanks for having me.
Great. Also, Professor H. Kwesi Prempeh, Executive Director of the CDD Ghana. Like I told you earlier, when we started the very first segment, that he's been locked down here. And we are so excited to punish him because he's not been available for us for a long time. But of course, anytime he's able to make time, he joins us to help, discuss. And I've read how some people, when they got to know that he was coming for this show, said he should make sure that he doesn't miss when he has to be on the show, because they want to hear his views on the matters of national development. Thank you very much, all of you. And I'll ask that for those of you who are getting your refreshment around, get seated and let's begin this segment of the discussion. Now, I like to start with you, Sule, and particularly because of where you are coming from. It's on record that the country Ghana has not done too well as far as media freedoms are concerned. And the 2019 World Press Freedom Index ranked Ghana 27th. So we dropped some 4 places because we had we're 23rd at the last time. So having dropped 4 places, the question was, why is it that a country that is seen and acknowledged globally as having done so well in the media front will so quickly, within a very short space of time, drop 4 places? And Media Foundation for West Africa, you did a survey, or you recorded press violations between February and March of 2019 only. You recorded 22 separate violations, and journalists had been violated in this regard. So going into 2020, what is it that can be done to, again, avoid this bad image for this country?
Well, Samson, I think to start with, I would want to put the issues in perspective. And the statistics that you read are accurate in terms of the position of Ghana in the World Press Freedom Index ranking, and also the incidence of violations that you talked about.
Right.
But it's also important to acknowledge the fact that around the world, press freedom is under attack. So it is not a Ghana phenomenon. However, if we were at 23 and we dropped to 27th, and that is global, it's important to also highlight the fact that, yes, we were at number 1 in 2017, and then in that is in Africa, and then by 2018 we have dropped to number 2. And that is not a bad, something that we would say, you know, across Africa, if we are number 2, that is not something that we would say is really bad. But as you acknowledge, between that short period, the number of incidents of violations continue to rise. And there was a point where we put out a release indicating that press freedom is actually in critical situation in Ghana, and actually called on the president to personally intervene, or at least to make a statement to indicate that it is something that he is personally concerned about. Now, I would want us to look at the situation of press freedom or media freedom from 3 broad perspectives. One is the issue of safety and impunity. Second is the political and policy environment. And the third is the economic environment. And I think this is important because quite often, in looking at press freedom, we look at it from the perspective of how many journalists have been abused, how many journalists have been beaten, and so on and so forth. As you rightly said, in terms of the safety area, the number of incidents of violations have increased, you know, over the last 3 years. Under President Kufuor, for the 4 years, the very 4 last years, and I'm using the 4 years because we are looking at 3 years now. The last 4 years of President Kufuor, for example, we had a total of 63 incidents. The 3.5 or so years of President Mills, we had 56. The 4 years of Mahama was 44, and we've done 3 years now, so 36 months, and we are over 50 now. So that is quite worrying. But for me, it is not just even the absolute numbers that is, much more worrying. It is about the gravity of the violations we are witnessing. You may have 100 incidents of violations, maybe a journalist slapped, recorder destroyed, police pick up a journalist, and so on and so forth. Yes, it is not the best, but if you even have one person murdered, that may be a worrying situation than where you have 100 people, about arrests and, camera destroyed and so on and so forth. And in our country, over the last 3 years, the worrying phenomenon is the gravity of the violations.
Okay.
Your colleague at Multimedia, Lateef Idris, and how significant that violation was. And it happened at the police headquarters, where we expect that, the people who are expected to protect us, they were the violators, in this instance. We know about the Swale incident. We know about the recent one about the national security storming, the officers of Modern Ghana picking up journalists, blindfolding them, taking them away. And later we heard about torture, no torture, and so on and so forth. And we know about, our own friend Manasseh, and the fact that at some point we had to facilitate his exit from the country. And even when he returned, he had to still be walking about with a police officer around. So we are witnessing a series of incidents that we would say, appear not to be the trend. And that for me is what is extremely quite worrying. We are also at a time when, in terms of the abuses, it is not just the physical abuses or the arrests and detentions and so on. We've gotten to a point where there is deliberate emotional and psychological abuse of journalists. And in fact, we are getting to a point where it's almost like, shut up and be safe. Otherwise, we'll continue to trail you. So on social media, if you are a critical journalist, you suffer the abuse. It's either they say, today you say this, and they say you are MPP, the next time they say you are NDC. And I believe that I follow, the commentary and the comments around when you post something. You know, it's either you are a biased moderator today, or the next time you are not fair to this party, and so on and so forth. And everything that you put out there, it's not about the facts of the matter.
Right.
It is about who your comment goes against or goes in favor. And I indicated recently that there was a report that says, if you take the MPP, for example, there are about 700 activists on social media, paid allowances, and their job is to make sure that when you have to discredit, when you have to abuse, do that. And the NDC is massively recruiting as well, having realized that, oh, Charlie, we waited and we were outsmarted in the 2016 elections and so on and so forth. And so it's not just in the area of vigilantism in the real space. I mean, we're talking about vigilantism also in the cyberspace. And I think that is extremely quite worrying. The other thing is the political and social environment, if I can be quick on that one, in terms of the media freedom. Now, we've witnessed in the course of the period a number of policy interventions that certainly do not bode well for media freedom. We can talk about the DTT, the digital terrestrial migration process, and how clumsy it has been. It has always taken the broadcast industry, GIBA, to intervene to get the ministry to either shift a position or change a policy and so on and so forth. We know about the Star Times, saga, where through Parliament, Star Times was granted a tax waiver of 3 million Ghana cedis to bring in equipment. And we have our own local broadcasters who are struggling, and there's nothing like that extended to them. We know about the recent decision or attempt to encrypt all free-to-air television programs in the country so that people can have access only on condition that you pay what was called a digital access fee. Again, GIBA and other actors had to step in to get the ministry to take a step backwards on that matter. Then, of course, we know about what, in my view, is obviously a politically motivated closure of a number of radio stations. And quite surprisingly, somebody sent me a letter from the NCA. This is a radio station in Drobo called Kiss FM. And the problem is that the NCA is saying, look, your license had expired in January 2008. You did not apply for renewal, and you only applied for renewal in 2015. That is 7 years after the expiration. And therefore, you should have applied 5 years earlier. You didn't do that. Even though you reapplied in 2015, you had already been caught up by the law, and therefore you are asked to shut down. I think that as you lawyers or as ordinary people would say, the laws are made for man and not man for the law. And we know the critical role the media plays. And so it's important that in applying the law, we don't seek to use it in a way that ultimately would collapse the system. But having raised all these points that are worrying, I think it's important we also highlight the fact that we have had the RTI law passed, which for me is a bold decision by the current administration, because we all know the implications, and 2020 is just here. Already some of us have lined up a number of requests that we are going to put before the various state institutions. So for me, it's a bold decision, and we need to commend the government for doing it. And I guess that as we go on, we would have...
Thank you for that quite a tall list of the issues that we can look at in this direction. But Liz and Sule refers to what may have led to the World Press Freedom rankings, what may have led to Ghana falling 4 places, dropping 4 places. And always people point to the murder of Ahmed Swale at the start of the year in January. The question many are wondering, and what people are not satisfied about, is that since his murder, there doesn't appear to be a concerted effort to try to bring the perpetrators to book. So examples are being made. Khashoggi was killed. We know there were clear political connections to his killing in October 2018. As we speak, 5 people have been convicted. And still, we know that the international community and press, freedom fighters are not excited about even that. They want more to be done. We know that in Malta, Daphne, a lady who was also, assassinated through a car bomb, and because of which the country has continued to have demonstrations, because recently somebody who was suspected of involvement in it is said to have mentioned that the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff was involved in ordering the hit. They have come to a point where literally the government of Malta is to step aside for independent investigations. Otherwise, the government is a failed one. When you look and compare what happened here and what is happening across the globe, does it tell you that we are failing in trying to protect media freedoms and journalists?
To some extent, yes. But let me say that, like Suleiman has pointed out, press freedom is under attack worldwide. And it's because probably people do not want the media to go a certain extent into finding out certain things that are now becoming public. Because now the media seems to be on the scene of things when they happen. And when they happen, instantly it's out there and people get to know what is happening. With Swale's case, I have asked myself several times, is it that the media is not angry enough? Is it that we are not demanding enough? Is it that we are not trying to protect ourselves enough? Because if you think that after so many months, not even one person has been arrested, the next question is, who next? And if we are not careful, we are opening ourselves up. The media used to be closed and the media used to be together. Now, as a result of competition, we probably are pitching against each other, and in pitching against each other, we probably are not looking out for each other. In my days of reporting, I can say that we had guidelines and we had rules that we had to work by, and you had to study it and you had to go by it. And you had to make sure that your integrity, your credibility was such that nobody could just use you and leave you. Today, it seems to be a little different. And with the proliferation of media houses, with media pluralism, there's so many things that are being taken for granted, and so many things are just happening in the media space without, should I say, proper controls. And if that happens, then the question is, how far would we go as journalists to kind of like put our guidelines aside and just try and work, maybe for our stomach's sake, what we'll eat. Maybe we've become biased, so we have aligned ourselves to certain people and certain organizations and certain political parties. And therefore, anybody talking against those political parties, we're standing as referees, and we're standing and try and make it seem as if we are above the law, and that whatever we say must hold. I think that in the past, the National Media Commission, the Ghana Journalists Association, Media Foundation for West Africa, Frederick Ebert Foundation, held constant workshops to keep journalists on their toes as to what to do and what not to do. We know what is right, but maybe for some reason or for some sensationalism, we go out of that domain. And when we step out of that domain, we open ourselves up to so many things and so many attacks. So how do we as journalists, how do we as the media close our ranks such that we can preserve the freedoms that we have? And we should remember that our freedoms come with responsibilities. And if you're not responsible enough, then you definitely would have people target you and come at you. But then again, the Constitution kinds of gives us room and space to operate. I came with my guidelines for political reporting.
Right.
I came with my guidelines of the national media policy.
Okay.
And we had to study these and know that you could operate in a certain space.
Okay.
Your rights, or my rights as a journalist, ends where somebody else's rights begin. So I have to work within that space. I have to work and make sure that as a journalist, I don't step out of bounds. If I step out of bounds, there are sanctions. I wonder how many of the journalists, the young ones that are coming up today, have studied the policies and know what to do and what not to do. I wonder if the NMC and the GJA are coming together to organize refresher workshops for journalists who are practicing, to know where they should go and where they shouldn't go, what they should do and what they shouldn't do. And I think that if we do that, we probably will be able to protect ourselves better.
All right.
There's somewhere in the political reporting guidelines that says that if you go into a party's congress, a party's space for reporting, you as a journalist become the responsibility of the party. So then the question is, how do individuals in that party assault you and the party is not held responsible? If I can find it, I'll quote it, I'll read it so we'll all understand.
Okay.
But let me say that even with the political reporting, and I think it holds with all kinds of reporting, whatever space that you enter, you're supposed to be truthful, you're supposed to be factual, you're supposed to be accurate. So we are supposed to give out the facts and the information to the public for the public to make up their minds as to what choices they want to make. The media today seems to be making the choices for the public. And that, to me, it's a difficulty. Leave the public to make up their minds after you've given them the information and the facts.
Okay.
Our opinions really as journalists does not matter. And I think that it holds today as it did yesterday.
Okay.
Our opinions as journalists don't matter. That's not what we are supposed to do. If you want to give an opinion, then you probably would come on Newsfile and want to do some analysis and say what you think should be. And I think that if we do not move away from just thinking that, okay, we are the setters of the agenda, and therefore we think that we should be able to control, we won't go very far. We would always have problems and would always have people wanting to attack us and wanting to harm us.
Okay. So I can clearly hear you calling for journalists to, as it were, acclimatize themselves a lot more with their tools and their codes of conduct and rules and regulations, but also asking groups like the Media Foundation for West Africa, Frederick Eberts, and Ghana Journalists Association, among others, to also intensify training programs to equip these journalists. I can testify, though, that Media Foundation for West Africa has been doing quite a lot of that, even in recent times. So, Prof, haven't heard Sule give us that outline, quite an exhaustive list, and having heard Liz also sort of come to talk about the journalist and the responsibility they ought to also shoulder for themselves, and how they ought to also look at the issues and protect themselves. What do you say about the current situation and we dropping 4 places as a country, and then the government and government communicators often heard say or suggest that there may be a justification for some of the attacks that media persons have suffered because you are not being credible or you are not churning out accurate information?
Well, I think let me begin just from this initial point about the sources of our strength as a country, right? The kinds of things that prop up the Ghana brand, the Ghana image, especially internationally. I don't think people don't come here because it is the cheapest place. It is not. You know, hotel rates are really high here. People don't come here because we have the best macroeconomic environments anywhere you can find, whether they come here as tourists or as visitors. I think sometimes we forget that the things that hold this place up are a few intangibles, like the peace of this place,
right,
like the fact that we make reasonably peaceful elections and turnovers of power transition peacefully from one government to the next, like freedom, the freedoms we enjoy, including the press freedom that we enjoy. These are the things that actually, in my view, account largely for the Ghana brand. It makes us more competitive than our peers in the region. It's what makes us a better place for a lot of people than maybe some other countries in the neighborhood. It's not because we have the best flora or fauna for tourists to come and see. But there's this air of freedom about this place, and of peace about this place, of stability about this place, that invites people in, and that we like to showcase. So I think it's important for us to recognize that, and that each time that any one of these things is threatened, right, whether by an act or omission on our part, we must be worried. I have witnessed, and especially, of course, I see on social media, I live there in that space, so I have also witnessed a certain growing hostility towards independent thought. Independent thought, whether exhibited by journalists or by those of us in the think tank space or civil society and the like. And when Bright was here on the previous segments, he kept talking about this growing intolerance, right, of dissenting opinion, which I believe has forced, as part of the reason why Bright Simmons is no longer on Facebook, right? He just had to voluntarily just exit, But I think, so when you hear, surrogates of one party or the other, government surrogates, paid or unpaid propagandists, communicators, whatever, when you hear them make light of the experiences of a particular journalist, right? So a journalist posts something about something they've experienced, and then there's this quick reaction, trivializing their experience. Even the death of Ahmed, right? I mean, there are some, immediately, they feel they must, once you say something happens in this country, it's a very funny situation where, we have a very perverse sense of patriotism, right? Where once a particular party is in power that you think is your party, then whatever happens in Ghana, even if it is not something to be owned by the government, certain partisans and surrogates of government feel they must jump in and own it, and therefore trivialize any other voice that is contrary to theirs. So this guy is killed. He may not have been killed because he was a journalist or because he was plying his trade as a journalist. We don't even know. And yet, quickly, certain, identifiable surrogates of a party step in and say, oh, but, why do you think he was killed? Trivializing some of these things. And Manasseh would narrate an experience he's had, and then immediately just people mock his experience, right? These things really don't augur well for the environment for press freedom, right? So I think, in a way, we have brought this upon ourselves, the way in which we have dealt with some of these incidents, right? And when it comes to these things, I believe very much in the broken windows theory of law enforcement, right? Which is that when you let the small things go uncorrected, and you allow them to fester, they grow into bigger things, and then big things begin to happen. So for me, I draw a connection between the last conversation we're having about vigilantism and this one. Just the atmosphere that we have created in this country, the very binary, acrimonious, incendiary tone of our politics, where you must be for me or against me. It's black or white, there is no shade of gray in the middle, and you are forced into one or the other corner. And if you don't belong, if you're neutral, oh, whoa, I mean, just who dare you to be neutral, right? All of this doesn't create an atmosphere that augurs well for press freedom. So I think, by default, we are working ourselves into this quagmire where, we are no longer, we are losing some of the things that we were really very well known for. We used to top all of the Africa press freedom rankings. We topped a lot of the other countries outside of Africa too, not just in Africa. Africa was easy to beat. We were beating many other countries in press freedom, and now it's fallen, and we should be concerned because, like I said, our brand does not rest on gold and cocoa and those things. Our brand as a country rests on these intangible things. On the safety of our streets, on the fact that you can walk here at night and feel safe, on the fact that when you come here, vibrant news, radio, you tune in, people are like, wow, Ghana, you have a lot of press freedom, there's a lot of conversation. When we lose that, trust me, we're going to lose a lot of tourism, we're going to lose a lot of investors, right? But we're also going to lose what it is that makes this place. So I think I find it regrettable that we're seeing this trend, and whether or not its governments is actively pushing it or not, I think for me it's the indifference. The indifference, a journalist is killed. One of the ways you want to show that this is not politically motivated, you should be immediately concerned that people will draw inferences and make attributions. So one of the things you do to allay all concerns about that is to actually basically double up on the effort to find the source, be seen to be actively pursuing this murder, instead of having surrogates and other, paid or unpaid communicators or other coming on social media to trivialize it and give other explanations for why this might have happened. So I think all of that is contributing to
Thank you. This is what I'm going to do. I'll take 2 comments or questions from you in the audience. I suppose everybody is tired. We've been here since 9 a.m. So let's have one being here and another to the microphone over there. Yes, 2 questions or comments, and then, okay. I'm not getting any lady to put up their hand. I would have added. Okay, so let's do a maximum of 4. So 2 here, 2 there. Okay. Yes, let's start with you.
Thank you very much. My name is Director of the Public Accountability Group, ASEPA. Media freedom and its accompanying problems is one of the issues of great concern, and we've had the opportunity to talk about it the whole year because of the incident that happened. The panelists have raised a number of issues which they make sense, and especially the point that have to do with the media not being able to be principled enough to hold thoughts of our people and even our politicians. And I will attribute it to the fact that the people have not been fed with the truth. We have not been fed with the truth. I have a problem where journalists sit on programs, political parties, representatives or politicians make statements. The journalist knows the truth, knows that what this person is saying is the truth. But the journalist is not bold enough to hold up and say, yes, what you are right, you are wrong. And is afraid of being tagged. And we've lost a number of policies and great things in this country because journalists in this country have not been bold enough to stand up to it. And I'll give you an example.
So that's a contribution, I think.
Just one example. You remember the distribution of free sanitary pad program that was initiated by the previous government. It was a great policy. This year, an Ethiopian has won the CNN Heroes Award for the distribution of free sanitary towels to girls. We have a challenge in Africa, even in Ghana. Over 25,000 young girls don't get access, miss school because of sanitary pad. But we had politicians used media platforms to bastardize the program. And we have journalists who could not stand up to the truth about this program. And today, that program is nowhere to be found.
Okay.
And today, that program is being rewarded.
Thank you.
So I think our journalists...
Thank you very much. So that's, yes, can we have you?
Jacob Hussein is my name.
Yes, if you can do it quick so that we don't,
fortunately, I'm also a media person.
Okay.
Great. Listen, I see that the media is not angry enough to fight for themselves and fight for the individuals who are doing their good work. Because of I call it the new media, evidence are easily transmitted, like WhatsApp videos. Once there is empirical evidence of what is happening, defending it becomes very difficult. That is causing for that assault on those who have the facts. Yeah. I had that this thing to tell some journalists that the best thing is, once you get the fact, share it quick so that you not be the target. Once the video is gone, once the fact is gone, we speak to the fact.
Okay.
And at times we need to be strong and tell the people who are lying that, please, the media is there to educate. If you don't have the facts, go and research and come.
Okay.
That will be the solution.
Thank you very much. So obviously, the kind of journalist you're looking for, there's one standing by you. Let's hear.
Okay, I just want to make a little contribution to one of the, or two issues raised by one of the panelists. One about the fact that irresponsibility on the part of journalists fuels these attacks. I disagree. We are not living in a jungle, and the Constitution has not made journalists untouchable. So if you feel aggrieved, you can sue the journalist for defamation. And if the journalist also feels aggrieved, he or she can also sue. So I don't want to believe, and I hear it a lot often these days. You find some members of government, when there's an attack, they go to talk about responsibilities. If the journalist says something or does something that is wrong, you can go to court and sue that person. There is nobody in this country, not even the president, has the power to raise or lift his hand against another person. So that one, I disagree. And also about the fact that journalists should not share opinions. And if you have opinions, not all of us are the likes of Kwaku who would have access to Newsfile. What journalists are not supposed to do is to mix opinions with our reportage.
Okay.
But once I have reported the news, I have the power to share my own opinion, whether on radio, television, social media, or even in newspapers.
Thank you very much,
journalists
Manasseh.
are not programmed robots. We can also share opinions. Thank you.
Thank you, Manasseh. Yes, let's have you.
I think it's quite worrying that journalists who more or less, you are like our watchmen, now are becoming targets themselves. And it looks like as a country, we are getting into this very dangerous path of impunity and some kind of tyranny, taking over. And so I think that beyond, the need for refresher courses like Liz said, and all other things that we're talking about, and your own colleague, Latif, I keep asking myself, what has become of that case? And it's worrying. And so I think that it's about time probably you, as journalists, you don't need to all belong to the same media house, because unity, I believe, is also very important for your profession. And to kind of re-strategize, how do you deal with the threat that confronts you?
Okay.
Because the statistics that Sule put out, I believe that it is not by coincidence. The deterioration in those statistics is not by coincidence.
Okay.
It is a conscious effort from some source, and you also need to take some conscious action.
All right.
As a professional.
Thank you very much. So all of you have expressed comments and sentiments about and concerns about what has happened in the media front. The question about Latif, the multimedia group, together with Latif, took a suit in the court against the police, and that is ongoing. So I'm sure that in due course we'll get to know how that ends. Can we get a minute each of you telling us how perhaps you want both the media and the people, the consumers of the media, to interact in 2020 going forward? Yes, Sule.
Well, I think that some of the issues have already been raised, and we cannot run away from the fact that having the public trust and building the kind of credibility that the media must build is one critical thing that must happen. Of course, because of social media, the question of who is a journalist continues to be a very, very big one. Is it the person who is posting content? Is it the person who is sharing the video on WhatsApp? Or who is a journalist? But of course, UNESCO and other entities would say anybody who gathers information for public consumption should be brought under the umbrella of journalism. And when we talk about safety of journalists, we need to include them. I think that the state has a responsibility. Indeed, when we were talking about the statistics, nobody can say that the president or any minister has been at the forefront of propagating violence against journalists. But the state has a responsibility. The police has a responsibility. And that is why at some point we thought that given the rising trend, the president ought to have made a statement to indicate that it is not something that he supports. And I think that is still something that is so crucial. Again, as journalists, we must also be familiar with the fact that the Constitution imposes a certain obligation on us in terms of we holding the people who must be held accountable at all times. And just to conclude, I like a statement made by the late P.A.V. Ansa, who said that, look, the relationship between the media and politics in Africa will continue to be one of tension and one of conflict. And at any point when there ceases to be a conflict or tension, then one of two things must have happened. Either the media may have been cowed into submission, or the media has just become an organ of the ruling party.
All right,
and I hope that is not what we're going to get ourselves
into. Yes, Liz, in a minute, what would you have to say?
Yes, I don't think that Manasseh really disagreed with me. When I talked about opinions, I was talking about reporting. And so if he says reportage, it's about the same thing. I'm talking about opinions in reporting. And when I mentioned Newsfile, I mentioned Newsfile as an example, because there are other programs that you can go and share your opinions on, or you can write feature articles and you can have all your opinions in there.
That's right.
But moving forward, I believe that the media needs to go back to the ABC. You know, we need to be accurate, we need to be brief, we need to be clear. We need to say what we have to say. I mean, we don't have to mince words. And again, I think that the media needs to stand together as a body. We're too divided when it comes to working as a media. Maybe because we belong to various media houses, we don't see ourselves as one, because there is competition in there. But definitely, competition shouldn't divide us as a people, as a body. And I think that GJ needs to wake up. I think it has been in slumber for too long. There are certain issues that are raised that I don't hear the GJ's voice. And I think that where journalists are concerned, and where our welfare and our safety are concerned, I think that the GJ should be heard more than they're being heard.
All right.
I think, again, that the NMC needs to go through maybe some restructuring to make them more proactive. You know, the NMC needs to be on top of issues when it comes to the media. It's not always calling the media when they have faulted. They need to be able to stand up and say that, okay, the media needs to operate in a certain atmosphere. And therefore, because of that, the NMC would be bold enough. We keep saying that they don't have teeth to bite, or they can back, but they can't bite. But it's not only the media that they need to be looking at. They need to be looking at stakeholders as a whole and ensuring that the media is safe.
Thank you very much. Let's hear from Professor H. Kwesi Prempeh.
So there's two quick issues. One, going back to something that Sule mentioned. I think he mentioned Radio Gold in one of his comments. And you know, the Radio Gold closure and the issue about that is something that, you know, we also at CDD we've been quite worried about it. We understand the role of the regulator, NCA, in this, but when a regulator that has been basically sleeping on the job, right, immediately wakes up and gets very radical, you know, and begins to apply a law that it has not previously applied, you know, I think that, you know, there has to be some way of managing that transition in a way that does not give the appearance of selective justice or persecution of the kind that I think people associate with the action that has been taken against Radio Go. Because if that is the most prominent opposition voice in the nation's capital, and it's all of a sudden closed, it is difficult to get the average Ghanaian to understand that politics has nothing to do with it.
Right.
So if this is going to be the new posture of the NCA, and of course other regulatory, other media regulatory bodies or media spectrum regulatory bodies do have similar powers, you know, of closing radio stations, usually for various reasons. You know, I think that whole palaver, in my view, ought to have been managed. That whole transition from an NCA that was asleep at the wheels to an NCA that is going to be an activist NCA ought to have been managed properly, with considerably longer period of engagement with the industry, giving them, you know, much longer grace periods so that they can all be brought in line with the law. So again, I think I would like to see a resolution of that going into 2020, because I don't think that it augurs well for the impression that it creates. Then I think I've heard both Liz and Sule and yourself actually, and others in the audience talk about the media and its own responsibility and part of this, right? The part that connects again back to the NCA is about media ownership rules. That increasingly you see political ownership and essentially co-optation of the media space. You know, the fear that PAV and SAR had actually may well materialize if we don't sit back and look at media ownership rules. Is it appropriate for us to allow the media? If you look at the constitutional architecture around media, clearly it was envisaged that media would be the trustees of the people, holding government to account on behalf of the people. In fact, that's almost the language in the Constitution. So when you allow that kind of resource to then be co-opted and owned by the same political class that is supposed to be, you know, the subject of media oversight, it creates the kinds of distortions we're beginning to see. And people feel like the media have now, you know, become owned by politicians, they are in their pocket and the like. And that might also fuel some of the public, disapproval of media behavior. So I think at some point we need to look at this issue of who is an appropriate person to own a media space in this country.
All right, thank you all so very much. And for all of you who have come into this auditorium at the UPSA this morning through to this afternoon, thank you all so very much. And thanks also to Suleiman Ibrahima, Executive Director of the Media Foundation for West Africa. Thanks to Liz Hefron Asari, journalist and consultant, media consultant, and Professor H.K.C. Prempe, Executive Director of the CDD Ghana. Thanks to all of you, particularly those of you who have kept faith from beginning to the end and are still here in the auditorium. We want to say a big thank you to all our viewers who have been watching and don't miss viewing Newsfile for anything almost all the time. Sometimes when you go to the YouTube page to check, just about an hour after Newsfile was mounted, you get really, really surprised, shocked at the numbers, the millions of people that get to watch Newsfile. We say thank you all. We thank you for the critical feedback, including for the gender balance and a more non-partisan, actors that you have been asking for. My production says to tell you that they have been listening to you, and if you have observed, they have started implementing some of the things you suggest. And going into 2020, you can expect a lot more, even though it's an election year. We may have, gotten very harsh for the purposes of keeping to the rules and for orderly progress of the programming. But if in the course of doing that, we hurt you or we offended you in any way, we say we are sorry. Please forgive us. And if I, in particular, have offended you in any way by doing what I do sitting here, I want to acknowledge that I am not without fault. So forgive me also. And you will remember that at the start of the year, something happened. One of the people who were supposed to come to Newsfile was being brought on. I completely had no idea who was coming, but once I was told that the person didn't meet the standards, and I did announce that the person didn't meet the standards, a party revealed the identity of the person later, and I have been lambasted over the period for it. Nana B is a good friend of mine, and I say I'm sorry for offending you in the manner you feel offended. Thank you all very much, and have a good afternoon.